Chapter 9:21. Wei Wei Bai packed up and went to school. There was a reason for going to school. The side mission was too powerful. She looked at the information. She knew that there were some anti-vampire humans in the school. These humans had all entered an alliance called Anti-Vampire. This name, could it be more violent and less attentive? She felt that she could get green by joining this anti-alliance. She was worried sick for the health bar above her head to turn green. Arthur had to rest and sleep during the day. Although his strength increased greatly after drinking her blood, he didn't go crazy during the day anymore. But because of habit, there was nothing special. He wouldn't wake up during the day. Wei Wei Bai carried her bag and was about to leave. Arthur suddenly pressed her shoulder with one hand and pressed her against the wall. Then he lowered his head and looked at her with some dissatisfaction. Wei Wei Bai also looked at him. The two of them looked at each other in a daze. Arthur snorted. What an ingrate. I've been so kind as to let you go to school, but you don't even show any gratitude. Then he lowered his head and asked for a deep kiss that made her blush. He kissed her until she almost collapsed. He asked someone to bring her a jewelry box and put on a beautiful sapphire bracelet and necklace for her. They were the latest and most expensive designs of the year. Wei Wei Bai's school uniform was also remade with a modified material. It looked bright and beautiful, and her long hair was combed to be especially soft and beautiful. What a cute little pet. When she first came, she was like a stray kitten. Now that he had taken care of her, it was obvious that she had an owner and was an especially expensive pet. Wei Wei Bai seemed to be a little resistant, but she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to go to school, so she endured it and let him put it on. Arthur held her face and said softly, "Okay, it's time to let out some fresh air. Remember to come back on time." After saying that, he let go of her and turned to rest. Wei Wei Bai heaved a sigh of relief. Then she couldn't wait to run out with her bag of books. She didn't miss this damn place at all. With Arthur's keen hearing, how could he not hear her cheerful footsteps? Seriously. Arthur frowned slightly. This little blood servant really didn't know his place at all. He was full of patience and gentleness. She did not feel grateful, nor did she follow him wholeheartedly. She even had the delusion that she shouldn't be allowed to go to school because she kept running out. The aristocratic school was really all kinds of high-end, especially the food in the cafeteria, which was very much to Wei Wei Bai's liking. There are some students in this anti-alliance, and the person with the highest status in the alliance is the student council president of the aristocratic school. The system flipped through the information diligently and explained to Wei Wei Bai. It couldn't be helped. Its host finally had that first night, so it had to take up a responsibility as a system. At least let her be happy, in one plane. As a system, it was also worried sick. Wei Wei Bai ate while thinking about how to join the anti-alliance. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the dining table not far away. That table was very lively. The president of the student union, Roth, explained some difficult topics to the students beside him while eating. He smiled gently. There was a faint halo around his short black hair. His handsome face leaned towards gentleness. He looked very much like the first love in everyone's dreams when they were young and inexperienced. Wei Wei Bai retracted her gaze and remembered this president in her plan. After she finished eating, she continued with the class and acted like a serious student. After the last class, the professor announced the end of the class. Wei Wei Bai then packed up her books and prepared to leave. However, just as she walked to the school gate, a group of women stopped her. They were her classmates, the female students of the aristocratic school. // Chapter 9:22. Wei Wei Bai looked at them expressionlessly. What? Are you going to invite me to a party for dinner? A large group of women were blocking her way. She thought that they were here to snatch the bride. How shameless. Stealing Miss Jessie's sea sapphire and still strutting around. A girl spat viciously and said. The rest of the students heard that someone was stealing and could not help but stop to watch. Wei Wei Bai's eyes were blank for a moment, then slowly brightened up. She was excited. Trash, someone's here to pick a fight. System. Trash? Wei Wei Bai, it's rare to meet someone who's picking a fight. I really want to take a picture of it, so I can remember it later. System. You calm down. She felt a little sympathy for the person who came to pick a fight, but any evil female antagonist came to pick a fight. In Wei Wei Bai's eyes, they were all precious animals. She had to watch and enjoy. Wei Wei Bai was very calm and raised her bracelet in a friendly manner. The sea sapphire you're talking about, is it this? She only had this bracelet and the necklace on her neck that were blue. Among the girls, there was a girl wearing a school uniform with long blonde hair and blue eyes, looking at her elegantly and slightly arrogantly. She gently opened the fan in her hand and said reservedly and disdainfully, "The sea sapphire is this year's newest design and also the most expensive one. My brother went through so much trouble to get me one, but because I had to change my clothes, I left it in the changing room and forgot to take it. I didn't expect to lose it." Wei Wei Bai's gentle smile did not change. "Is that so? What a sad thing. There's actually a thief in this damned school." Jessie's eyes turned cold, and the fan fanned even faster. "That's right. Shameless. This thief is dirtying my mouth if I were to say her name." Wei Wei Bai casually raised her hand and flipped her hair, purposely showing off her sea sapphire. Her smile was slightly provocative. "Oh, so you know the thief's name. Hurry up and catch her." This attitude was very hateful. Sure enough, there was a female lackey at the scene who immediately exploded. She rushed over and was about to snatch the sapphire from Wei Wei Bai's wrist. "You shameless thief. You're just a lowly woman from the slums. Who doesn't know how poor your family is? How could you have the aquamarine?" Wei Wei Bai took a few steps back to avoid her and faintly raised an eyebrow. "You think I stole it?" Jessie sneered. "Otherwise, where did your sea sapphire come from? Poor people are really lowly things. Our school shouldn't have recruited people like you." The discussions around them grew louder. Most of them believed that Wei Wei Bai had stolen something. Wei Wei Bai smiled and didn't care about this false accusation. Instead, she undid the bracelet and pinched it between her fingers. The sapphire bracelet sparkled. She looked at Jessie coldly, her smile unchanged. "Are you sure this thing is yours?" Jessie frowned. Of course, it wasn't her. After all, such a new gem hadn't been officially released yet. It was just that the blueprint had been released. Only one design had been released, and it was especially precious. She had always hated Wei Wei Bai, this green tea bitch. Recently, the school had been selecting the most outstanding students to get a chance to further their studies. Money couldn't buy it, and Wei Wei Bai was very likely to be promoted because of her excellent results. When she saw Wei Wei Bai come to school in the morning wearing a gem, she immediately thought of framing her. Wei Wei Bai's reputation was tarnished, so this opportunity might fall to her. After all, everyone knew that Wei Wei Bai came from a poor family. She couldn't afford to use a gem unless she was a mistress. Chapter 9:23. It was enough to spread the name of a thief. It didn't matter if she was wrongly accused. Anyway, even if she was kept, she was just a lowly mistress. No noble would be willing to offend her family for a mistress. So Jessie was fearless. She elegantly raised her neck and looked at Wei Wei Bai coldly. It was as if she was looking at a lowly bug. "Yes, this gem is mine. I can't believe that there is a thief like you in our school." Wei Wei Bai's smile didn't change. Her eyes were encouraging. It was good to find fault with girls. She hadn't seen them for a long time. "Let's have a few more together." Let her warm up. Always facing Arthur, that Chinibu, she was really tired of looking at him. Wei Wei Bai felt that she couldn't be too calm. Otherwise, when the other party saw that she was too calm, it wouldn't be good if they didn't play with her. "I didn't steal. You are wrongly accusing me." Wei Wei Bai's expression changed. She was a little scared and took a step back. Her lips trembled and her face was a little pale. The discussion around them became louder. This was simply a sign of guilt. If she didn't steal, why was she so scared? Jessie looked at it. This gem definitely came from a bad place. The last trace of worry in her heart was put down. She immediately took a few steps forward aggressively. If you didn't steal, then where did you get the money to buy this? Wei Wei Bai pursed her lips and stared at her. She opened her mouth but couldn't say anything in the end. It seemed that there was something that was hard to say. Jessie immediately looked around proudly. More than half of the students were watching. The accusation of theft would definitely spread. To make the effect better, Jessie sneered and said loudly, "I swear in the name of a noble that the sapphire that Wei Wei Bai is wearing is mine." When this sentence came out, the eyes of the people around changed. After all, a noble's oath was very serious. If they were not careful, their reputation would be ruined. Since Jessie dared to swear like this, then Wei Wei Bai was definitely a thief. Her grades are so good, but her character is so bad. It's disgusting. I'm actually in the same class as a thief. Inform the principal to deal with this, and kick her out of school. The crowd surrounded Wei Wei Bai. She stood in the crowd, her face pale and helpless. She muttered, "No, I didn't steal." But she couldn't say where her gem came from. The system coughed lightly. "Well, it feels good to pretend to be a weak white lotus, doesn't it?" Wei Wei Bai covered her face and said weakly, "Everyone is wronging me. It feels good. I haven't been wronged in a long time. It's time for me to pretend to be pitiful." The system silently squatted down. "Host, your pleasure is too different from others. Are you giving up on yourself now that you've lost your first time?" Wei Wei Bai turned her face away and looked around for help. She happened to see the student union president pass by. Roth seemed to be surprised by the number of people and could not help but stop in his tracks. Bai Weiwei found an opportunity, and her eyes fell on him. She said weakly, "I didn't steal anything." His eyes were so pitiful that it made one's heart soften. Roth was slightly stunned, but before he could say anything, Jessie frowned in disgust. At this time, she was still using her delicate face to seduce others. Roth was her secret crush. How could this green tea bitch look at him with such a disgusting expression? Stealing is stealing. You still dare to quibble. A woman like you should get out of school. After saying that, Jessie angrily rushed forward. She raised her hand and ruthlessly slapped her face. Wei Wei Bai's eyes turned cold, just as she was about to kick Jessie out of the way. One hand, cold as ice, white as bone. Just like that, it passed through Wei Wei Bai's back and squeezed Jessie's wrist. Jessie's expression changed. She was in so much pain that cold sweat broke out and her whole body trembled. Is at https://www. com// Chapter 924. Wei Wei Bai's body also stiffened. A hand hugged her waist, and she leaned against a hard and cold embrace from behind. "Oh, you hit my people. Is this your so-called aristocratic demeanor?" The man behind her had a deep and gorgeous voice. His cold breath brushed past Wei Wei Bai's ear. And Jessie was also ruthlessly thrown out by that hand. Jessie fell heavily to the ground and finally couldn't take it anymore and screamed, "So dirty." The man behind her disdained. He opened his hand and gently touched Wei Wei Bai's delicate face. "You're still clean." Wei Wei Bai's mouth twitched. Was her face toilet paper? Didn't his conscience hurt by rubbing it like this? "Why don't you tell them that I gave you the gem?" The man behind her said in a cold tone. Wei Wei Bai pursed her lips, lowered her head, and didn't say anything. She even seemed to be resisting his hug. "Let go of me. This is school." Arthur snorted indifferently and ridiculed her. He fiercely pressed her into his arms, bit her ear, and whispered to her in a low voice in front of everyone. "Why, am I so shameful? Or is a blood servant with the status of a prince too lowly and not worthy of such an excellent and kind student like you?" He wandered around the castle in broad daylight and couldn't sleep at all. The little blood servant went to school. The castle, which used to be considered good, was suddenly worthless in his eyes. The little blood servant laid on the antique lounge chair and read a book. The little blood servant drank afternoon tea at the gorgeous little round table. And the bed, Arthur's face darkened. Why did he always think of Wei Wei Bai when he saw everything? And he actually couldn't sleep? This was simply a disgrace to the vampires. He shouldn't have let her go to school. He should have just obediently stayed in the castle and had everything she wanted. It would be easy for him to open a school in the castle. And class had already ended. Why wasn't she back yet? If it weren't for the fact that the bats following her didn't act strangely, he would have thought that she had escaped. She was late on her first day of school. She should accept his punishment. Arthur immediately summoned his mount and excitedly went to the school, intending to personally bring her home. However, as soon as she landed, she heard that she had been framed for stealing gems. How could anyone bully her when he wasn't around? Furthermore, was it that difficult to say that the gem was his? As long as she revealed his identity, who would dare to offend her? Or was it because she still wanted to escape from him? Was that why she didn't dare to let others know that she was his blood slave? A dark and cold anger surged in his chest. Arthur looked at Wei Wei Bai coldly. He wanted to see how long she could hold on. But in the end, she stood there silently and was beaten up. She was his woman, so he could do whatever he wanted. And other people's dirty hands were not qualified to touch a single strand of her hair. Arthur crushed the dirty woman's wrist. He grabbed Wei Wei Bai's arm coldly. Come home with me. It seems like you're not very popular in school. If you want to go to school, I'll hire a teacher for you. Then, without giving Wei Wei Bai any chance to speak, he picked her up and left. When he walked to Jessie's side, he looked at her coldly. The stunningly handsome prince had red eyes. When he looked at people, it was as if he could steal their souls. His thin lips moved slightly. The oath of a noble is too insignificant. How can a person like you swear in the name of a noble? Human nobles. They were all appointed by bloodlings. Arthur's light and gentle words destroyed Jessie's entire family. Your family's honor has been stripped away. Everyone is expelled from the noble circle. Chapter 9:25. After that, he walked forward in large strides. A huge black bat descended from the sky and landed beside Arthur meekly. Arthur glared at the bat. Scram. After that, he angrily spread his black bone wings. His cold and powerful aura pressed down on everyone present. Then, he carried Wei Wei Bai and disappeared. After Arthur left for a while, the students on the ground finally dared to stand up, trembling. Who is he? This was everyone's doubt. He was handsome and powerful, and his aura was overwhelming. As a human noble, Jessie was like a lowly ant in front of him. The principal also rushed over and yelled at Jessie, who was still sitting on the ground and enduring the pain. Do you know who you have offended? That's a vampire prince. How can you frame a prince's blood servant? A vampire prince. Currently, there were only 3 princes in the vampire race, and they all held the position of the 13th elder, jointly leading the entire vampire race and the human race. Offending a prince would result in a tragic death. Jessie knew that she was done for when she heard that. She lowered her head in despair, and the people who were flattering her ran away immediately, afraid that they would be implicated. Ross stood far away. When he heard the prince's identity, a dark calculation flashed through his eyes. Then he turned and left. Wei Wei Bai's expression was cold. An open-top plane was not something a person could enjoy. Her long hair fluttered in the wind, and the sour feeling of it hitting her face made her want to walk, not fly. Arthur looked down at her and smiled coldly. Suddenly, he stopped on the roof of the tallest building in the city. The roof was tilted twice. He put her on the horizontal bar in the middle of the roof, then stood aside with his arms crossed. He looked at her coldly, not daring to get up. The roof was dozens of stories high. If she fell, she would definitely die. Wei Wei Bai's body stiffened. The wind on the roof was strong, and she was about to fall. She looked up at Arthur, and her lips moved as if she wanted to ask for help. Arthur bent down, stretched out a finger, and pressed her lips. His cold eyes were full of gloomy anger. Understand who I am to you. Wei Wei Bai's eyelashes trembled as confusion appeared in her eyes. Arthur released her lips and stepped back a few steps. Wei Wei Bai was afraid and reached out to grab his trousers. Arthur immediately recalled the first time they had met. She was also like this, helplessly grabbing onto his trousers, begging him for help. At that time, he was full of annoyance. But now he was a little confused. It was just a blood servant. But he wanted her to admit it herself. Arthur moved his trousers, and Wei Wei Bai immediately panicked. "Don't kick me." These words caused Arthur's body to stiffen for a moment. At that time, he kicked her away. Was she still afraid? She was afraid that he would kick her out. Wei Wei Bai was afraid that he would kick her away, so she could only say unwillingly, "You are my master, and I am your blood servant." He had clearly heard what he wanted to hear. But why didn't he feel relaxed at all? Arthur's eyebrows creased with irritation. What else? Wei Wei Bai asked blankly. What else? This sentence caused Arthur to be stunned. Right? What else? She didn't answer wrong. Her identity was a blood servant. Arthur originally wanted to punish her for hiding her identity at school, but when he touched her cold fingers, he knew that the wind on the roof was cold and that she might get sick. He frowned and immediately picked her up. He jumped off the roof expressionlessly and flew directly back to the castle. After returning to the castle, he pressed her into the bed and impatiently kissed her. It seemed that he wanted to hide something. Wei Wei Bai suddenly struggled. She bit her lips, her face extremely pale. Am I not a blood servant? Why must you force me to do this kind of thing? This is not what a blood servant should do. Arthur was already very irritable, and he urgently needed her body to make himself happy. He firmly grabbed her resisting hands and said with a cold and evil smile, "Oh, if this is not what a blood servant should do, then who has the qualifications to do this?" Wei Wei Bai's eyes showed a trace of extreme sadness, and then she laughed at herself. In the past, I thought that the person who would do this to me was my lover, my husband. Lover, husband. This form of address made Arthur stiffen. Blood servants indeed didn't have the obligation to accompany their master to bed. After all, vampires wouldn't easily do this kind of thing with a lowly blood servant. Even if they were licentious, they still had a choice. But he couldn't help but force her. This kind of restraint, could it be that his feelings for her weren't just that of a blood servant? Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 50. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here and read at https://www. Sashu. Com transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here, comma. Chapter 9:26. Arthur released by Wei Wei. Then, with a cold expression, he gave her a gloomy look. Then, he turned around and walked away without hesitation. Wei Wei Bai laid on the bed, stunned for a while, then slowly put away the expression on her face. She let out a sigh of relief. It's finally the emotional turning point. She spent a lot of effort to change Arthur's concept of a blood servant to that of a lover. The goal of this world. For him to admit his feelings for her, he had to first deny her identity as a blood servant. All kinds of pretentious acts. All kinds of bullies. All kinds of troublemakers. Finally, she got to this point. Wei Wei Bai rubbed her face, then went to eat dinner. When she finished showering and went to bed, Arthur still did not appear. Bai Wei Wei yawned very patiently. Then she covered herself with the blanket and went to sleep. Only by eating and sleeping well would she have enough energy to attack. Just as she was about to go to sleep, the system suddenly said, "Tonight, the Anti-Vampire Alliance will be holding a gathering in the West City Cathedral to discuss the important matters of how to wage war against the vampires." Wei Wei Bai said indifferently, "Okay." The system said, "Go to the gathering and you can get 1/10 of the green." Wei Wei Bai was about to go to sleep, but then she saw the HP bar above her head. The HP bar was shining brightly. The self-detonation punishment for her cheap mouth. She could only resign herself to her fate and bid farewell to her soft bed. Then, she put on her clothes and a hooded cloak and went to the party. This was a blood feast. It had just started, and the blood breeds who came were either rich or noble. This blood feast was called the Rose Blood Feast. Every girl was a noble, and they had all signed a contract, so they knew what to do here. Unlike normal blood feasts, no one died in this Rose Blood Feast. Instead, it was a feast for the blood breeds to choose their blood servants. Arthur held a wine glass in his hand. The blood breeds could eat very little. Their main food was human blood. And secondary, there were only a few things. The red wine in his hand was specially brewed for the blood breeds. It was so expensive that only the nobles could afford it. Arthur drank the wine like he was drinking water. His face was expressionless, and he even looked at the beautiful girls in the living room with tiredness. It was obviously very good food. However, he had no appetite at all. Even though his mouth was dry from thirst, his body was warning him of hunger. However, he felt that these women were dirty and smelly. He already had a blood servant of his own, but he was still hungry, because he didn't dare to eat to his heart's content. He was afraid that he would break her. Moreover, he didn't rest well during the day, which made him very irritable. He's been so off lately. In the past, when there was no blood to drink, no matter how hungry he was, he would not feel so uncomfortable. But now, he felt very uncomfortable. Had he recently placed all his attention on that blood slave who didn't know what was good for him? Arthur drank another glass of wine expressionlessly. This wine had a very strong magic power that could make vampires drunk. Occasionally, vampires also needed this kind of entertainment. However, his body was too strong, and the magic of the wine was unable to make him completely drunk. Suddenly, a trembling but fawning figure approached him. "Your Royal Highness, I am willing to be your blood slave. Please let my family go." A woman knelt at his feet, her face full of fear. Arthur sat on the chair indifferently. His legs were elegantly crossed, his elbows were on the armrest, and his hand was holding the wine glass. His eyes were cold and empty. He glanced indifferently at the humble girl at his feet. Wasn't this woman Jessie, who bullied Wei Wei Bai? Chapter 9:27. Jessie was also forced to the point of no choice. All of her family's noble titles were removed. All of her assets were frozen. Her family was driven to the slums. She was unwilling. She had to redeem herself. When she heard that there was a blood rose banquet, she used the hidden family badge to successfully obtain an invitation. Wei Wei Bai, that lowly woman from the slums, how could she compare to her? Jessie boldly raised her head to look at the prince who could control her life and death. He lazily leaned on the chair, his expression cold and arrogant. His long silver hair was tied with a golden ribbon. Only a few strands of hair fell beside his handsome face. This man simply had a cold gaze. He could make any woman kneel down to curry favor with him. Such a young, strong, immortal-looking prince with unparalleled power and immense wealth. He could have any woman he wanted. Jessie was immediately stunned. If her heart was for her family before, now she was greedy. She wanted to get closer to this perfect vampire. Arthur drank a mouthful of wine, his voice as cold as ice. "Back off." Jessie trembled and immediately backed off respectfully. "Back off again," he indifferently ordered. Jessie kept backing off, retreating until she was about 10 meters away. Arthur coldly said, "You stink too much." The smell of this woman's blood was simply too unbearable for him. Jessie was shocked by these words, her face incomparably pale. She forced a smile and said, "Your Highness, I've already bathed. Maybe the perfume is not good. I'll go change it now." Arthur leisurely swirled his wine glass, not having the time to listen to her. He looked up at the ceiling light. What was his little blood servant doing at this time? Sleeping? Or was it because he wasn't here and she couldn't sleep? Like him? His mind was full of her. No matter where he went, it was all about her. Arthur suddenly snorted in anger, his expression becoming a bit sinister. He hated that his mind couldn't be controlled. Jessie immediately felt the suppression of her level and painfully trembled. But she persevered, slowly crawling forward. She had to get his attention. It was said that other than Wei Wei Bai, Prince Arthur had never had a blood servant. As long as she stood out from the crowd, she would definitely be able to gain the prince's favor with her beauty. When that time came, she would make Wei Wei buy, and those who looked down on her suffer a fate worse than death. Arthur suddenly asked coldly, "Have you ever been occupied by someone in your mind?" Jessie lay on the ground and stopped crawling forward. A wave of ecstasy swept over him. She had caught his attention. Everyone knew that Prince Arthur did not care to speak to humans. Instead, he asked her questions. Jessie immediately rolled his eyes and said humbly, in a fawning manner, "I didn't before, but after seeing your highness tonight, I realized that from now on, my mind can only hold your figure." Arthur's lips curled into a mocking smile, but Jessie lowered his head and did not notice. She heard his deep and cold voice. "Then, why is your brain only able to accommodate me?" Jessie immediately grasped the question and finally dared to look up at him again. She completely revealed the infatuation in her eyes. She was like a shy girl facing the person she loved. "Because I like your highness, the prince." No human would dare to say that they liked him. If she said that, it would definitely make her stand out from the crowd. Arthur's face was filled with confusion, but it disappeared in an instant. He said playfully, "You like me?" Chapter 9:28. Jessie immediately said, "Only when you like someone can you think of him all the time. When you leave his side, you feel uncomfortable, as if you have lost the most important thing. Whether it is in your heart or in your mind, there is always that person's shadow." When she said this, she lowered her head humbly. "I have such feelings for his highness." After saying this, she wanted to kiss his feet. Kissing the feet was the lowest and most lowly form of salute in the vampires. If one person did this to another person, it was not a complete humiliation. It was a complete submission. Arthur suddenly stood up. When he bit these two words, it was heavy and fierce. Murderous intent boiled. Jessie kissed the floor, and her teeth almost fell out. Arthur turned and left, casually instructing the people around him. A lowly human who approaches the prince without permission, a stowaway who does not have the right to appear in the Blood Rose banquet, hanged. Jessie was stunned for a moment and did not react. This was her crime. She had already been dragged away by 2 guards. Not long after, there was a scream. Arthur's eyes were terrifyingly cold, but his fingers were trembling. He liked a blood servant. It was only because her blood was delicious. How could he have such illogical feelings for a lowly human? He picked up the wine and drank a few glasses. He found that he still could not erase the image of Wei Wei Bai in his mind. Arthur's expression turned ugly. He smashed the glass in his hand, then turned and walked out. Suddenly, a feminine and pleasant male voice sounded. "Arthur, why are you so emotional today? Don't you have a blood servant? Are you still not full?" A series of questions. This made Arthur frown. He turned and saw a short-haired young man in a white suit appear behind him. It was one of the 3 princes, Moore. He had lived for much longer than him. Moore's eyes were gentle and beautiful. Compared to Arthur's sharp and delicate appearance, his temper was obviously better. Arthur's bloody eyes were incomparably cold. "Why don't you go and exterminate those anti-vampires? Why do you have time to care about my business?" Moore had always been in charge of tracking down the anti-vampire rebels. He was very busy and rarely appeared at banquets. Moore smiled. "I heard that you have a new blood servant that you love. I'm curious how delicious her blood must be to move your stone heart and anorexic." Arthur reached out with strong, pale fingers and gripped the collar of his white shirt, strangling him. He indifferently lowered his blood-red eyes, which were filled with incomparably cold, killing intent. "Don't touch my people, or I'll tear you into pieces and throw you into the flames." The only thing that could kill vampires was fire. Only in the first 7 days of a newborn would they be afraid of sunlight. A hint of excitement appeared in Moore's long and narrow eyes. "Since you're so protective, it must be very delicious." Arthur's fingers instantly crushed his throat. The sound of bones breaking was exceptionally horrifying. Moore was unable to struggle for a moment. His strength was actually not as strong as Arthur, who was younger than him. Arthur threw him to the ground and picked up a tissue to wipe his hands in disgust. Listen up, my blood servant has my mark. If anyone dares to have any ideas about her, I'll make that guy die a horrible death. Domineering words of a Chinibu. Because of his strength, it seemed incomparably violent and real. Moore was a complete pervert, and he was also a collector. He liked to collect all kinds of young girls with different flavors of blood. Chapter 929. Once they entered his castle, no human could withstand his torture and abuse and survive. Arthur thought of his little blood servant. Would be remembered by a disgusting guy like Moore. He even had the urge to kill a prince on the spot. Moore climbed up from the ground awkwardly, reaching out to straighten his tilted head. He was not angry at all. Instead, he was smiling. Okay, I know you have a strong sense of territory. I won't touch your things. Arthur's pale and delicate face looked strong and violent because of the cold, murderous aura. He snorted. You better. Moore immediately raised his hands in surrender. You're really angry. I was just kidding. Look at your bad temper. Why don't you come with me to eliminate the rebels? Arthur said coldly, not interested. Moore spread his hands. Look at you. You're so scary. You'll scare your poor little blood servant to death when you go back. It's scary if you don't get rid of your murderous aura. Arthur had already turned to leave, but when he heard his words, he stopped in his tracks. Moore took the opportunity to come over. Let's go. We received a tip tonight that the so-called Anti-Vampire Alliance is gathering at the west side of the city. Let's go have some fun. Arthur looked down and saw that his fingers were still trembling. He pursed his thin lips, and on his cold face, there was a struggle of confusion. He suddenly shook his head, wanting to shake off that damned emotion, and then he stepped forward. Let's go, in case those poor little bugs escape. Arthur said with murderous intent. He suddenly did not want to go back to the castle. The more he wanted to, the more he could not get rid of her image in his mind, and the more he did not dare to approach her. It was as if this could hide those feelings that were about to burst out. Wei Bai wore a mask and sneaked into the gathering. The real meeting was at the back of the church. They gathered in front of the church to discuss how to fight against the vampires. Wei Bai ate the fruits provided by the gathering in boredom. The church was very remote and looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. The crows outside were cawing and there were a lot of mice inside. She missed her warm bed and delicious desserts. The system said, 5 more minutes will be enough. Your HP bar will turn green by 1/10. Participating in the gathering meant that one was a member of the Anti-Alliance. The system automatically assumed that this was the completion of the mission of resisting the vampires. As for whether Wei Bai had really joined the Anti-Alliance, it was not that important. Wei Bai nodded and began to count down the time. She had to be back before dawn. If Arthur found out she was at the party, with only half of the favorability, it was very likely that the enraged vampire would think that she had betrayed him. Then he would directly kill her. At that time, all the side quests and main quests would be useless. Wei Bai said to the system, if Arthur appears, remember to tell me. The system flipped through the male lead's whereabouts. He's here. Wei Bai was still in a daze. He went back to the castle? This was not easy to handle. She could only leave in a few minutes. If she had to spend an hour rushing back, she would have to think of a decent excuse. For example, she was in a bad mood and went for a walk or something like that. The system was silent for a moment, then laughed awkwardly and said, No, I mean, he's already outside the church. Wei Bai immediately stood up and pulled the hood tightly, not letting her conspicuous brown hair show. Hurry up and run. The favorability is only 50. Any trick of self-injury won't work. Chapter 930. For the first time in her life, a favorability of 50 made her feel uncertain. It was the system's first time seeing such an unconfident host. It immediately said, the back door is behind the cross. Run quickly. Wei Bai nodded. She hurriedly grabbed the collar of her cloak and ran quickly. But before she could reach the cross, a hand suddenly tugged at her arm. Wei Bai almost tripped. She turned around and saw a man wearing a mask. He had short black hair and was tall and slender. He looked somewhat familiar. The system immediately reminded her, the president of the student council. All the anti-vampire members of the city had come for today's gathering. Wei Bai didn't have time to chat with this undercover president. She used all her strength and raised her leg to kick his calf. However, the other party was one step ahead of her. He quickly retreated and pulled her into his arms. He seemed to be a little surprised, but more than that, he was smiling. "Look what I've caught, the little darling of His Highness the Prince," he said softly, his fingers carelessly touching her mask. Prey that walked right into the trap. "Tell me, how did you get here?" The people who came here were all anti-vampires. Only those who understood the special code could find this place. Wei Bai had never appeared in their list, so she shouldn't have come to this gathering. Wei Bai heard the system's reminder. The castle has been surrounded. Only the back door and the escape route are left. If she didn't leave now, she probably wouldn't be able to. Wei Bai's expression changed. She was a little panicked, but more than that, she was calm and brave. "I'm here to join the Anti-Vampire Alliance." The president didn't quite believe her. "Oh, you're living a high and mighty life. These are all bestowed to you by your master. Are you willing to part with them?" After all, there weren't many humans who could resist the temptation of being favored by vampires. The system suddenly reminded her. Batty. Wei Bai, on the other hand, spoke too quickly. Her emotions were also very quick. "I hate vampires. If it weren't for vampires, I wouldn't have been reduced to a captive. Furthermore, the humans that vampires harm are my own kind. How can I tolerate this?" Her eyes were sorrowful and resentful, but there was also natural pity. "Everything the vampires gave me was dirty. I've been looking for you for a long time. You don't know how happy I am to be able to join you." The system sighed. "Bats are," with a wave of her hand, Wei Bai put on a righteous appearance and took the opportunity to break away from Los's embrace. Then he swore, "I will never submit to a vampire. That so-called master is just a despicable bandit to me." Luosi was stunned for a moment, and the killing intent and vigilance in his eyes faded a little. "It's very dangerous for you to join so rashly. Go back first, lest your master becomes suspicious." The various emotions in Wei Bai's eyes calmed down. She said gently, "Okay, thank you for your reminder." This could be considered as a crisis being averted. Only then did she remember to ask the system, "What did you say Batty is?" Just as she finished speaking, the alarm outside the castle suddenly sounded, and the crows were all startled and flew away. Everyone's expression changed. "Not good. The vampire army has arrived. Quickly evacuate from here." Los immediately grabbed Wei Bai's hand. "Let's go." There were too many people, and they all ran to the back door in fear. Suddenly, a bat screeched and attacked Los. Los had no choice but to let go of Wei Bai's hand and threw out the fireball in his hand. The bat immediately disappeared on the spot, dodging the fireball. Is at https://www. com//
The.
Chapter 931. A few key traitors have disappeared, and all the traitors in the cathedral were killed by Prince Arthur. Moore was helpless. Arthur's murderous intent is really strong. Doesn't he know to leave someone alive for interrogation? Suddenly, he smelled a sweet scent of blood that he had never smelled before. The hairs on his back stood up.
This smell was the best.
Moore immediately turned around to look for prey with this scent of blood. But he saw a familiar cold figure walking over from the cathedral. He carefully carried a petite body wrapped in a black coat. It was wrapped from head to toe, only revealing some beautiful brown curly hair. And the sweet scent of the highest quality came from the human in Arthur's arms. Poppy blood was a fatal attraction to vampires above the Duke rank. The higher the rank, the more irresistible it was. A poison-like scent. It was addictive. Moore immediately rushed forward, his eyes full of greed and excitement. "Is this a survivor of the rebel army? I thought you had killed everyone." Moore finished speaking and reached out to take Wei Wei Bai from him. He was in charge of dealing with the survivors of the rebel army. But just as he reached out, a red light blade flew toward his body. Moore's expression changed. He raised his hand, and a blue ice blade collided with it. The blue ice blade was dissolved by the powerful light blade. Moore still couldn't dodge in time, and the light blade cut a frightening wound on his chest. Arthur's handsome face was like an ice sculpture, and his eyes were gloomy and irritable. The rebels in the cathedral are all dead. Where are your hands? She's mine. Moore coughed and laughed as he spat out blood. This is against the rules, Arthur. Even if she's your blood slave, her identity must be strange. Let me guess, this blood slave is a spy. You have to hand her over. Arthur looked at him coldly, his face expressionless. But his voice was gentle and soft. Do you want to die? I'll grant you your wish. Moore's expression changed, and he quickly left. But it was too late. Countless light blades lit up the dark night. An abyss-like fissure appeared where Mo Air was standing. Any vampires facing such an attack, they might not be able to piece their bodies back together and die. Arthur carried Wei Wei Bai and walked over with a cold face. No vampires dared to stop him. After returning to the castle, Liz hurried over. When Wei Wei Bai ran away, she knew something was wrong. No matter how jealous she was of this human was Prince Arthur's blood slave. She was the one responsible for losing her life. If she entered the dungeon, her job as a housekeeper. So she rushed over. When she saw Arthur carrying Wei Wei Bai, she was worried. His Highness, Mississippi. Arthur glanced at her indifferently. This gaze made Liz's hair stand on end. It was filled with a terrifying killing intent.
Liz.
Arthur.
When. He.
Moore. Wasn't she leaving him? He would not betray her as she wished. He would destroy all the rebels. If she dared to leave him, he would cut off all her escape routes. No matter where she escaped to, she would be in his palm. This life.
No.
This life was not enough. A human's life was too short. She should accept his imprisonment and punishment for all eternity. Chapter 932. Immortality was a scary word. His first reaction was not to kill her. Her crimes were enough to kill her 1,000,000 times over. Arthur's heart hardened, his eyes sharp, and he threw by Wei Wei into Li's arms. Liz hugged her in a hurry. Arthur turned around and left. Throw her into the lowest level of the dungeon. Liz was shocked. Even the highest level of the dungeon was unbearable for humans. The lowest level of the dungeon was so bad that humans would probably die within a month. Liz hugged Wei Wei Bai and was in a dilemma. Did this blood slave offend the prince? She looked down and saw half of Wei Wei Bai's face popping out of her clothes. Her eyes were tear-stained, and under her face, there were horrible bruises all over her snow-white neck. It was obvious that they were violent kiss marks. Liz's hands trembled, but she still obeyed the order and sent Wei Wei Bai to the lowest level of the dungeon. The dungeon was extremely dark, with only a small lamp. There was no sound, only endless darkness and endless silence. It was enough to drive anyone, including the blood breeds, crazy. When Wei Wei Bai woke up, she complained, "At least let me take a shower, my whole body is," the system said. "Put it mildly, if you're too direct, I'll have to look at the bullet screen again." The bullet screen army was now controlling even the conversation. Whoever dared to say dirty jokes would be banned from the bullet screen. Wei Wei Bai shut up and moved her feet. She heard the sound of iron chains clinking. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Is this the imprisonment joke?" This joke was not only old and hard to understand, but it also frequently appeared in her strategy world. The system said earnestly, "Just bear with it, although your affinity won't go up, you're green by 20%. Wei Wei Bai looked up and saw that her HP bar was green by 20%. How did it turn green so quickly? The system explained, Because the male lead is the main character of this time's elimination of the Anti-Vampire Alliance, and because you resisted and rejected him, causing him to be hurt, the main system considered that you succeeded in resisting the vampire army and gave you a green score. Wei Bai. This weird calculation method. Very experienced, she pulled on the chain and calculated the length. Then, he looked at the system's map of the dark dungeon. She found that the dungeon she was locked in was the largest and most well-equipped one. There was also a bathroom. Although it was very old, at least there was water, ice-cold water. Wei Bai didn't care about anything else. She probably wouldn't be able to sleep with such marks on her body. Shivering from the cold, she groped her way through the shower in the dark. Only then did he realize that he only had Arthur's coat left. As for the rest of his clothes, they were all torn apart. Wei Bai did not mind. She wrapped her body in the clothes and curled up to sleep. The strategy had been derailed to this extent. She was very glad that his favorability was still at 50. She sorted out the entire process from beginning to end. Then she counted her life points. It was so painful. Every second spent was painful. Wei Bai, who was so stingy that she was trembling, gritted her teeth and bought a data modifier from the system.
Change it for me.
Change it severely. Anyway, do whatever you want to do with vampires. In this world, the strategy target had no grudges with her. She thought that there was finally a small and fresh world, and that she could have a sweet and beautiful strategy trip. She didn't expect that the strategy target had no grudges with her. She had to work hard to have grudges with the strategy target. Yes, the data she wanted to change was this. The original owner's parents were both killed by vampires. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on Chapter 933. The atmosphere in the castle was getting more and more gloomy. Before Wei Bai came, Prince Arthur's work and rest were very normal. He would sleep for a few months, then wake up for half a day and continue to sleep. At most, he could sleep for a year. Then, he would get up to participate in the blood feast, or meet the most delicious young men and women who had been strictly selected. Of course, without exception, he would fall into irritable hunger with nothing to show for it, because none of those humans could satisfy his appetite. In the end, he could only drink some artificial vampire food that replaced blood. The food tasted very bad, but in Prince Arthur's eyes, at least the food didn't smell like humans. Of course, for all vampires, the smell of humans was delicious, and they couldn't understand the feelings of an anorexic vampire. So he slept most of the time. As the most powerful vampire, the prince's hobby was to sleep. This caused the servants in Arthur's castle to be very leisurely and orderly. But everything ended after Wei Bai came. As Prince Arthur's first blood servant, this blood servant's identity and status were very special. For her, Prince Arthur woke up every day during the day and didn't sleep at night. As a result, all the vampire attendants and human maids in the castle didn't dare to lower their guard. The most terrifying thing was that Prince Arthur's emotions began to become more extreme. When he was happy, it was like a spring breeze. When he was unhappy, it was like a tornado. The entire castle was destroyed into ruins. And now his emotions were like a huge tornado, and it was continuous. He would be irritable for as long as Wei Bai was locked up. Many rooms became the target of his anger, and under his red light blade, they were completely turned into broken stones. Liz estimated that in a few days, the castle would collapse, because many of the load-bearing walls were destroyed by their prince. The current castle was only a little bit better than a ruin. Liz trembled a little as she carried the wine and came to another room. She was really terrified of the current prince. After all, it wasn't just the castle that was destroyed, but also many people who were affected and died by his power. Entering the room, the sun shone in from the huge balcony. Arthur sat on a chair with a blank expression, next to a pile of wine bottles. These were extremely expensive liquids that could make vampires drunk. To Arthur, it was like drinking water. The more powerful a vampire was, the harder it was for them to be affected by the demonic power of the wine. Liz lowered her head and respectfully put the wine on the table next to her. "Your Highness, we have guests." Arthur looked at the sunlight outside the window coldly. Sunlight was one of the things that vampires hated the most. Although they weren't affected, vampires liked dark environments. Looking at the sun for a long time was like humans being suppressed in a dark environment for a long time. It could easily affect one's mind. He was silent and cold, like a sharp blade that emitted a terrifying killing intent. Rise's body trembled even more violently. She was in a lot of pain. She could only leave in a hurry. "I'll just tell the guests that you're resting." Suddenly, he said coldly, "Let him in." It seemed that he already knew who the visitor was. Liz immediately bowed and said, "Yes, Your Highness." Just as she was about to turn around and leave, the prince's voice sounded hesitant. "Is there anything wrong with her?" Liz's footsteps froze. She thought of the information sent by the servant who monitored Wei Wei Bai. She could only shake her head with difficulty. "Miss is sleeping most of the time. She looks a bit weak." For convenience next time, you can click on the button below to record this reading record. Chapter 934. Arthur didn't say anything, but he still didn't want her to leave. Liz knew that he wanted more information. She thought for a moment before answering. Miss didn't refuse the food and didn't show too much emotion. Arthur was silent for a moment. "What else?" Liz hesitated and said, "She seemed a bit cold." After all, the lowest level of the dungeon has an extremely cold environment, which is very bad for humans. Suddenly, a cup was smashed on the ground. "She didn't regret what she did, or call my name to beg for mercy?" Liz kept beating around the bush, not daring to say too much. She was afraid that Arthur would ask this question, because that blood slave was terrifyingly stubborn. In such a silent and almost lightless environment, there were many powerful humans who had entered. They couldn't hold on for more than a few days, and their minds couldn't take it. But in these few days, she didn't show a trace of regret or discomfort. At first, she was jealous and disgusted, thinking that humans were too weak and mediocre, and definitely not worthy to stand beside the noble and perfect Prince Arthur. Now, she could only admire. Another cup was smashed on the ground. Arthur said darkly, "She ate and slept well. Did she think that I wouldn't punish her?" Last time, he was gentle to her when she had nightmares, which made him panic, so he didn't go to the dungeon for the next few days. He wanted to torture her, but he could only hide here and drink. Liz immediately said fawningly, "The environment of the dungeon is not suitable for humans to live in. It's estimated that in a month, the cold will enter her bones, and she won't be able to hold on and die. Also, in the dungeon, the cold will torture her body like ice thorns, making her very painful." Arthur crushed the wine bottle in his hand. He lowered his head, his messy silver hair covering his dark red eyes. "She's in so much pain, but she still won't beg for mercy. It seems that her heart to rebel against the vampires is strong," he said with a cold smile. "Even if she calls my name," his tone became weak, like he was pleading, with a trace of pitiful grievance. Every time he fell into a state of self-pity, the room would start to be destroyed. Thinking of those vampires and humans who died tragically, Liz took the opportunity to leave. When she walked out of that oppressive room, she let out a sigh of relief. Now, she was not jealous of Wei Wei Bai at all. Following by the side of such a murderous god, who knows when they might even lose their lives. Moore, who was covered in bandages, walked to Arthur with a gentle smile. He took a new cup and poured wine for himself. "Why are you in such a bad mood? Who provoked you?" Arthur glanced at him indifferently. "Not dead yet." There was an indescribable pity in his tone. Moore's smile deepened. He lowered his head and approached him. "What's wrong? Where's your blood servant? Where's that beautiful cutie who appeared in the rebel army and tasted so sweet?" Arthur raised his head. His cold red eyes reflected Moore's sinister face. "I heard that you locked her up. Are you suspecting that she's a spy for the rebel army? Instead of dirtying your hands, why don't you hand her over to me? I'm good at extorting confessions." Arthur was expressionless. He lowered his voice and said, "Do you know why I want to see you?" Moore's smile was gentle. Because I'm your best friend. Arthur shook his head and suddenly raised his hand. A red circular magic array appeared. Moore's expression changed. If he was hit by this power, he would really be crippled. Although vampires could regenerate continuously, if they were hit by Arthur's magic power, there was no possibility of recovery at all. Chapter 935. Moore quickly dodged the attack. The powerful force shattered a wall in the room. Arthur also stood up slowly and gracefully. His back was to the light. His face was cold, but his aura was cold and threatening. I'm in a bad mood.
I need a sandbag.
You're more durable. More. I finally know why the butler looked at me with pity. When Arthur was in a bad mood, he hit a sandbag. It was too cruel. Moore couldn't afford to offend him and wanted to escape, but he found that the room was sealed by magic. Everyone in the Bloodline Empire knew. Arthur, who inherited the power of the ancestor, was extremely strong. He had no opponent at all. Moore used all his strength to escape and was not disabled, but he was still pinched by Arthur with one hand and thrown a sandbag several times. In the end, he had no strength left and lay in the room that looked like a ruin. Arthur was in a better mood. He turned around and picked up his wine glass. He stood on the half-ruined balcony and watched the sunset. You can get out now. The prince couldn't take his beating. What a piece of trash. Moore stood up impatiently and staggered out. When he reached the door, he suddenly turned around and smiled maliciously. By the way, I've given the information of your little blood slave to the Council of Elders. After all, it's a prince-level blood slave. It's a big deal to be suspected of being a spy. Arthur suddenly turned around. What did you say? Moore smiled, but the corners of his mouth twitched. Arthur, what's wrong with you? It's just a blood slave. If it's really a spy, it'll be dealt with immediately. You don't feel bad, do you? Arthur immediately retorted. Who feels bad? It's just a lowly human. Moore agreed. Yes, it's just a human. No matter how good the blood is, if it's a traitor, it should be sentenced to death. The Council of Elders will send someone to pick up your blood slave in a few days. You can just hand him over then. With that, he immediately turned around and left. Arthur raised his hand. A murderous blood blade appeared and aimed at Moore's back. But Moore's words suddenly flashed in his mind. You don't feel bad, do you, bad? He felt bad for that lowly human who didn't know what was good for him and only knew how to resist him. The blade disappeared in his hand. He turned around and sat down again. He continued to drink expressionlessly, but his fingers holding the glass was shaking. Wei Wei Bai ate and drank well. She was not mistreated by the food. Although the water was cold, a cold shower was good for the brain. Plus, the system played the Free Pleasant Goat and Big Bad Wolf. Ultraman fought against the little monsters. Big Head's son, Little Head's father. Super Speeder 1, 2, 3, 4. It made her feel as if she had returned to her childhood, and she actually enjoyed watching it. The dark and quiet environment was no pressure for her at all. The system was exasperated. Look at these cartoons. Other than Ultraman, can you watch the rest? Wei Wei Bai. Then what do you recommend? The system said, Peppa Pig. Wei Wei Bai. He felt that there was no difference. The system said, you've been locked up for a few days, but your affinity and green bar haven't increased at all.
Pull yourself together.
Wei Wei Bai looked at Peppa Pig and said with a laugh, Isn't this waiting for the information about my feud with vampires when I was young to be exposed? Arthur has to investigate this himself to be credible. The system was anxious. He didn't investigate at all. Wei Wei Bai said, Don't worry, I'll cry a few more times and have a few more nightmares. Then he'll be suspicious and investigate. By then, his affinity will definitely increase. Just as she finished speaking, the system reminded her. The male lead is here. Wei Wei Bai's happy expression disappeared, and her body curled up. She looked pale and haggard. After a cold shower, her face was as pale as it could be. In the dark, the sound of the door opening was very obvious. Arthur's footsteps were sluggish as he walked in. His red eyes were filled with suppressed emotions, as if he was about to explode at any time. Download the at https://m/sashu.com// to make it easier for you to read it next time. You can click save at the bottom to record this chapter.
Comma.
Chapter 936. Arthur had not slept so deeply in a long time. He had always been tormented by hunger, so he was extremely alert even when he was sleeping. Recently, he had not rested at all and had been relying on alcohol to survive. In the end, he hugged Wei Wei Bai's warm and soft body. The feeling was so good that he was unwilling to wake up. His hands could not help but want to hug her even more tightly. In the end, he only hugged air. Arthur suddenly woke up and found that there was no one else on the stone bed except for himself. His cold and ruthless expression instantly turned into panic. He was about to rush out like lightning. Did she escape? But just as he walked to the door, he heard fragments of sorrowful cries, which sounded suppressed in the darkness. Arthur's footsteps stiffened, and he turned to look at the ancient bathroom. It was made of stones, so the soundproofing was not bad, but it could not stop the vampire's good hearing. She went to take a bath again. The cold water, the cold and dark dungeon, this was not a living environment prepared for humans. Her body was in a very bad condition. Be sensible, she knew that she should not touch cold water at this time and accelerate the loss of her life. So, was she asking for death? Or would she rather die than leave his traces on her body? Arthur's hand reached for the door. With a light push, he could pull her out. "Dad, Mum, I want to go home." This sentence was so wronged and pitiful. The soreness in his body stopped Arthur from pushing the door open. "It's so dark here, I'm scared." He stood in front of the dark door, listening to her helpless cries. "I won't be tempted by him. Vampires are my enemies." This sentence made Arthur take a few steps back. His cold face finally showed signs of struggle. She hated vampires, to the extent that she saw them as her enemies. It was not that there were no rebels, but more humans lived a good life under the vampire's rule. He clearly gave her such a good status and life. Everyone should be envious of her. But she still did not know what was good for her and stupidly wanted to go against him. All vampires were her enemies. No, he was the one who should be her enemy. Arthur's red eyes trembled a few times. Finally, he held back his anger and turned to leave. If he didn't leave, the killing intent of the Blood Clan in his body would erupt. As the blood-kindred prince, he could not allow a human who had joined the rebel army to live. Letting her live until now was already the limit. Heartache? He was just a lowly human being. It was not worth his heartache. Arthur closed the heavy dungeon door and walked out with a gloomy face. The next day, the garrison of the House of Elders sent someone over. They were in charge of the trial of the rebel army. As for Wei Wei Bai's appearance at the rebel army's gathering point, the Elder Council believed that she was most likely a spy by the prince's side. If something happened to the Grand Prince, the Empire would suffer heavy losses. Everyone attached great importance to this spy incident. Arthur sat in the room, the moonlight illuminating half of his delicate and cold face. His eyelids were half closed, and his thick and long eyelashes cast a shadow under his pale eyes. Liz said cautiously, "The Elder Council is here to ask for him." Arthur was expressionless. After a moment of silence, he said coldly, "Let them take him away." This sentence was like a blade, full of killing intent. The cold and cruel prince seemed to want to make a decision. He suppressed the surging emotions in his heart, not allowing himself to be swayed in the slightest. Chapter 937. The pride of a prince did not allow him to have the slightest bit of pity for a human who resisted him. This was cowardice. He hated himself for being controlled by unknown emotions, making his cold and unshakable heart a captive of those inexplicable feelings. So he had to give up on Wei Wei Bai. The humans who were suspected of being spies who were taken away all ended up dead, without exception. Outside the huge stone balcony, under the cold moonlight, the Elder Council of Vampires wore black hooded robes. A petite figure wearing a dress prepared by Liz and a long cloak walked out of the castle. She staggered, her long curly hair fluttering with her footsteps. The moonlight shone on her face, giving her a kind of crystal-clear beauty. She seemed to have sensed something and looked back. A pair of beautiful brown eyes, under the moonlight, dimmed a lot, like amber honey. Her eyes were calm, without fear or regret, and she did not beg for mercy. She even took the initiative to walk towards the Grim Reapers, then extended her slender and weak hands to let them handcuff her. Arthur suddenly stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, staring at her with a terrifying gaze. She finally realized that someone was staring at her. Wei Wei Bai looked up again and saw him standing on the balcony. The silver-haired vampire looked down at her, like a god looking at an ant. There was a slight fluctuation in her eyes, a fragile longing, struggling pain, and a trace of imperceptible admiration. These were all emotions that only lasted for a moment. In the blink of an eye, they were suppressed by her. She lowered her head, thinking of something, but she smiled as if relieved of a burden. This smile was very relaxed. It was as if going to die was a relief for her. Then she did not look back and left with the vampires. The vampires' car left the castle. It slowly disappeared in front of Arthur. Arthur was stiff for a long time before he realized that his fingers had crushed the stone railing on the balcony. He suddenly turned around and continued drinking, unable to calm down. But for some reason, he kept thinking of her smile of relief in his mind. Did she not know that she was going to die? How could she still smile? It was as if leaving him, even if it was death, she would still be happy. But what did her last look mean? Arthur held the glass and lowered his head. His fingers kept trembling. Until dawn, he still couldn't figure out why. And because he drank too much wine, he finally felt drunk. He did not resist the magic of the wine and let the drunkenness drag him down. In a trance, the sun shone in. A white figure, like a butterfly, landed lightly in his arms. He looked up in surprise, only to see Bai Weiwei looking at him with a smile. "Arthur, do you like me?" Arthur stared at her blankly for a long time and couldn't help but reach out to touch her face. What an obedient face, white and cute. This was his little pet. He couldn't help but nod. "If you're obedient, I'll like you." Bai Weiwei suddenly lowered her head and kissed his thin lips, lingering and warm. This kiss made him feel an overwhelming sense of pleasure. She leaned against his neck and murmured, "Am I good?" Arthur reached out to stroke her hair and smiled gently. "Very obedient, Bai Weiwei. Then do you like me?" Arthur said, "Yes." He liked her so much that he became weak, cowardly, and he hated himself for being so hesitant. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 60. Chapter 938. He just liked her. He knew, so he had to cut off this emotional tie before it turned into a deep love. Because he hated the weak, he only wanted to be strong. But when she was in his arms, he couldn't help but want to pamper her even more. He sighed and kissed her hair. "Don't resist me anymore, just be my blood servant. When your blood doesn't taste good, I'll grant you the identity of a vampire." Didn't all humans like this identity? They liked it so much that they didn't hesitate to kill each other. After Arthur finished speaking, he suddenly realized that there was nothing in his fingers. He woke up from his drunken state, and the warm sunlight shone on him. He sat on the floor, surrounded by wine bottles. There was no sign of Wei Wei Bai. Arthur's expression turned cold. He was stunned for a while. Then he stood up, walked into the room, and entered the coffin. He decided to sleep. Humans were fragile. When he woke up, she would be old and dead, no longer able to affect him. Wei Wei Bai was in the prison of the elder's house, gnawing on tasteless bread. "Sigh, this stupid Chinibu is too hard to attack. I've already lost half my life, but his favorability has only climbed to 60. I'm so cute. Why can't the target fall in love with me at first sight, have deep feelings for me at second sight, and have a favorability of 100 at third sight?" The system said earnestly, "How can you love someone based on their looks? Love is too superficial." Wei Wei Bai thought for a while. "No, if a 300-pound fatty were to chase after me, I definitely wouldn't be moved." Even if that fatty was the richest man in the world, had the best talent, and the best personality. She couldn't do it. The top narcissistic dog Wei Wei Bai said straightforwardly, "I'm ugly. I don't deserve love." System. It was bad enough that she was ugly, but she was still cursed every day. Could you give these ugly dogs a way out? The closed door of the dungeon opened, and a young man with a feminine appearance walked in, followed by a few guards. "My little cutie, you look so pitiful." She was very cute, but what was up with this man who acted so familiar with her? The system immediately told her about Moore's information and his perverted fetishes. He was not her target. Wei Wei Bai was not interested. Moore squatted down and said in a friendly manner, "You're Arthur's blood servant. How can you be used to such coarse food? Give me another dinner." Wei Wei Bai looked at him silently. But she didn't reject the dinner. Her movements were restrained and elegant. It was impossible to tell that she was a human who had walked out of the slums. Moore observed her with interest. After all, it was rare to find such a tasty human. This aroused his intense appetite. He couldn't help but gulp and say, "What's your purpose in getting close to Arthur?" Bai Weiwei glanced at him indifferently and continued to eat. Moer's smile became warmer, but his eyes were very cold. Did the traitor's spies poison their own blood and then feed it to him to make him weak? This was a tactic that the traitor army spies often used. Suicide attack. They turned themselves into blood servants and turned their blood into poison to corrode the vampire's body. Wei Wei Bai finally finished eating. She wiped her mouth with a napkin and said calmly, "Purpose? I look down on vampires and hate you. I don't want to get close to you, and I don't want to have anything to do with you." To facilitate your next reading, you can click on the button at the bottom to record your reading record. Next time you open the bookshelf, you will be able to see it. If you like. Chapter 939. Moore looked at her coldly, but suddenly picked up a glass of wine beside him. "If what you said is true, then drink it." Wei Wei Bai was not afraid. "Is this poison wine? That's good. I've had a delicious last dinner, so I'll die a worthy death." After that, she drank the wine without hesitation. Moore stared at her, but he did not see any trace of fear in her. There really were humans who were not afraid of death. After drinking the wine, Wei Wei Bai started to feel dizzy. She collapsed on the ground and looked at Moore helplessly. The system said, "This wine is a confession potion. You'll tell the truth after drinking it." Wei Wei Bai frowned. "How effective is it?" The system said, "Who do you think is the most beautiful person in the world?" Wei Wei Bai said, "Me." She was straightforward and not hypocritical. The system said, "The confession potion's effect is that your answers are so honest." Basically, she would answer whatever Moore asked without any pretense. The system said proudly, "My magic is boundless. I'll give you some spiritual support so you won't be affected by this thing." Wei Wei Bai was alarmed. "How much life points do I have?" The system said, 3 days. Wei Wei Bai was speechless. Moore had already started to ask, "What's your position in the rebel army?" A blood servant of the rank of prince must have a high position. Wei Wei Bai was confused and finally answered, "What's the rebel army?" Moore was speechless. What the hell? Didn't she appear in the rebel army's gathering? How could she not know what the rebel army was? Sensing something was wrong, Moore asked again, "Why did you appear in the rebel army's gathering?" Bai Weiwei frowned and seemed to be resisting something, but her weak struggle only lasted for a while. Finally, she couldn't hold on any longer and said weakly, "I was scared. I could only run away from him, but I didn't know where to go. Then I saw a few people in cloaks and masks running past. I followed them." Moer raised his eyebrows. "Walking with strangers? Aren't you afraid of death?" Wei Wei Bai weakly muttered, "I'll die if I fall in love with that damn vampire. I'd rather die than let him know that I like him." More. "Who do you like?" Wei Wei Bai was silent for a moment. Tears suddenly flowed from her eyes. "I like that bastard who sucked my blood. How could I like him?" Moer. He was stuffed with cold dog food. He was here to interrogate the prisoner, not to listen to the confession of a girl's secret love. Wei Wei Bai cried and said, I should hate him. I hate all vampires. You killed my parents. I hate you. Immerse, Wei Wei Bai. Why would I like him?
He won't even look at me.
He even locked me up and abused me. More silently covered his ears with his hands.
Get lost.
He did not want to eat this kind of dog food. He was a single bat with dignity. So, at the end of the interrogation, Wei Wei Bai was just a fragile human girl who had a grudge against vampires, but did not do anything harmful to them. She was also a pitiful little girl who fell in love with her master. She was not a big fish in the rebel army at all, let alone a damned spy. If the spy was this kind of mentally retarded girl whose head was full of pink bubbles, the rebel army would have been destroyed long ago. Moore was a little disheartened. He touched her face with pity. Although I know you are not a rebel, you have a grudge against us. Plus, Arthur has feelings for you, so you'd better die. Chapter 940. Arthur's emotional fluctuations were so obvious. Only that emotional retard didn't realize how he felt about his blood servant. Arthur was very important to the blood kindred kingdom. His combat power was heaven-defying. He was the pure-blooded descendant of the ancestor, and he was God's favorite. He was the most likely to take over the position of the 13th Elder. Moore himself was a strong supporter of Arthur. That was why he would remove any obstacles to Arthur's succession in advance, including the ridiculous possibility that Arthur would fall in love with human girls.
He would remove it in advance, too.
That was why Moore said to Wei Wei Bai with a rare pity, I won't torture you anymore. I wanted to suck your blood dry, but since you didn't hurt Arthur and even adored him, I'll let you die quickly. There were many kinds of death sentences, and he would choose the less painful one to reward her. After that, Moore stood up coldly and turned to leave. Wei Wei Bai is a traitor. Since she didn't cause any harm to the blood kindred, we'll let her off lightly. We'll choose the easiest death sentence. The clerk behind him recorded it immediately. After he left, Wei Wei Bai struggled to sit up and leaned against the wall tiredly. I feel tired. The system said, you have a fever. It was a problem caused by taking a cold shower. Wei Wei Bai touched her head. She really did have a fever. The system said, you'll be executed tomorrow. Do you want to use your life points to escape? Wei Wei Bai said, what's that Chinibu doing? The system said, he's suffering from insomnia. He's irritated and asked someone to find a beautiful girl for him to drink blood. Wei Wei Bai said, I'm not dead yet, and he's already looking for a replacement. That scumbag. The system said, escape first? If the target's affinity was too low, he might not remember to save her. Wei Wei Bai thought for a moment, then closed her eyes and said softly, let's wait. Tomorrow is the turning point. If he doesn't come, we'll think of something then. She was used to wandering on the edge of life and death, so she accepted it calmly. If she wanted to fight for her life, she had to give it her all. The blood kindred's execution time was at night. She was led to the judge's stand. A vampire with a long sword stood beside her. Wei Wei Bai's hands were tied with ropes. Her face was flushed red as she looked around tiredly. Moore sat in the front seat, and beside him were several guards who accompanied him. The sword will cleanly cut off your head. You won't feel any pain. Immerse raised his hand casually. The prisoner, Wei Wei Bai, colluded with the rebel army to murder the prince. Her crime is unforgivable. Death penalty. After saying that, the vampire behind him pulled out his sword. The cold sword light reflected the moonlight. Wei Wei Bai was just about to communicate with the system to purchase the items needed to escape. However, that blade was extremely fast, and very soon it arrived at her neck. A strand of long hair was cut off and blown over her shoulder. Before she could dodge, the sword froze. It stopped half a centimeter away from her neck. She looked ahead. He saw the shocked expressions of Immerse and all the officials. Just as she was about to turn around, a beautiful pale hand covered her eyes. Then her entire body was pulled into someone's embrace. This embrace was so cold and domineering, but also filled with a sense of security. His voice was low and suppressed, with a trace of vexed fragility. I'm hungry. Wei Wei Bai's body stiffened, as if she couldn't believe who was behind her. The man's kiss was on her neck, but he didn't hurt her. His long hair fell over her shoulder, so gorgeous that she could see the light. Without you, I can't sleep. It was a cold voice, but it was as soft as a child who couldn't find his home. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 65. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. // transmigration system. Male god, come here. The download address is at https://www.
Sashu.
Com transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. Chapter 941. He lowered his head and buried it in her thin shoulder. His silver hair draped over her body. In his red eyes, there was a weak, confused, and tired softness. This was the first time the strongest vampire in the Empire had shown such a weak side in front of others. He didn't even want her to see him. It was as if he had lost in front of her when she saw his weak side. During the few days of her trial, he experienced for the first time what it meant to pass a day like 100 years. He had never felt that time was so hard to pass. Wine couldn't do it, and those young boys and girls couldn't do it either. He couldn't sleep, and he couldn't eat. He could only think of her. This feeling was too painful. Arthur covered her eyes tightly. He pursed his lips and said in a low voice, "Come back with me." This was a plea. A vampire was pleading to a human. This unprecedented humility surprised and shocked all the vampires present. Wei Wei Bai's body leaned in his arms. She was stiff and seemed to be resisting. The prince who had chased her here had really thrown away his 100 years of face and dignity. He restrained her with his arms and said word by word, "Come back with me. Don't be stubborn, okay?" He was actually asking. He didn't take her away domineeringly and unreasonably. Wei Wei Bai looked at the health bar above her head silently. It had turned green. When she didn't answer, the health bar increased by 10%. A total of 30% green. She didn't expect that resisting Arthur would give her so much green. It seemed that Arthur's identity and status were very important in this vampire empire. So important that the empire would tremble if he was uncomfortable. She stopped while she was ahead. After all, it was very dangerous to resist a vampire prince to death when his favorability hadn't exceeded 70. Plus, her body really couldn't take it anymore. Her body was weak, she had a high fever, and cold air entered her body. No wonder this plane only took 6 months to conquer. If this continued, this body would really only last half a year. Wei Wei Bai felt the embrace behind her. It was getting more and more confining, even to the point that she couldn't breathe. At the last moment when Arthur exploded, she finally nodded gently. He nodded his head in a reserved and suppressed manner. But to the vampires behind him, it was the most beautiful answer. He sounded agitated. "You've agreed to go back, Wei Wei?" But before he could get a reply from the girl in his arms, she had already softly leaned against his chest and fainted. Arthur was shocked and reached out to cup her face. Her face was abnormally red, and her body temperature was higher than normal. He was not a human, so he did not immediately notice that something was wrong with her. Only now did he realize that her body temperature was frighteningly high. Arthur's face darkened. He reached across her knees and easily hugged her into his arms. Bai Weiwei furrowed her brows tightly and let out a pained and fragmented groan. The redness in Arthur's eyes deepened, as if a terrifying storm was brewing. He looked up at Moore. His eyes were filled with killing intent. Moore gripped the armrest tightly. He stood up slowly and said with a smile, "Arthur, she is a member of the rebel army. Are you trying to protect the rebel army?" Once this accusation was put on him, it would not be easily dealt with. Arthur's expression turned cold. All the weakness he had in front of Weiwei by just now had disappeared. He said calmly, "Yes, I am covering for her." So matter-of-fact and domineering. Moore finally could not smile. "Arthur, she is only a human. Even if she turned into a vampire through the embrace, she is still a sub-vampire with a low status. The Sacred Blood Conference is about to begin. Are you planning to give up your position as the leader? Chapter 942. The Sacred Blood Conference was a voting system. If Arthur chilled the hearts of the vampires, then he would not get support. He did so many things to let Arthur get support. How could he completely lose this opportunity because of a human? Arthur was expressionless. He did not feel Moore's emotions at all. He asked indifferently, "Did you touch her?" She had a few traces of Moore's aura on her. It was something that could only be touched when a vampire was very close to a human. If it were not for the fact that he could not find traces of torture on her body, he would have already exploded. Moore saw his murderous intent. He could not help but show his bloody teeth, his red eyes frightening. "If I touch her, will you kill me?" Arthur did not answer, but directly raised his hand. A huge red blood blade array suddenly appeared. In an instant, blood blades appeared everywhere at the execution site. Magic power formed a terrifying sealing circle around them. No one could run out. Arthur wrapped his coat around Wei Wei Bai, then walked out calmly and elegantly. When he passed by Moore, he lowered his head, his eyes cruel and cold. "You didn't touch her this time, so I won't kill you." His tone was like a gift. Facing a vampire of the same prince level, Arthur looked like he was facing a lowly slave. He had been in a deep sleep for many years. He rarely woke up and he rarely went out. So many people had forgotten how terrifying and cruel he was when he quelled the rebellion, and how admirable he was. As long as he was around, the vampires, no matter what happened, they would not be wiped out. Moore once again felt the suppression that surpassed the prince level. They were of the same level, but Arthur could suppress him. Moore watched as Arthur carried his cute little blood servant and walked out as if nothing had happened. If he wanted to protect a rebel, no vampire would dare to stop him. Not to mention, Bai Weiwei wasn't part of the rebel army. How pitiful. I thought we were friends. Moore got up helplessly and began to look for his broken limbs. The attack this time was too powerful. A few of the vampires at the scene were crushed on the spot and could not recover. They died. He was slightly better off. He only had a few broken ankles and hands, and his intestines were all over the floor. He just had to stuff them back in. Wei Wei Bai slept painfully. She felt hot and cold at the same time, and a cold hand kept touching her face. The torment of ice and fire made her unable to sleep soundly. Then he began to have nightmares. She dreamt that her life points were all eaten up by the system, and then she pinched the system and died together. "Trash, you didn't steal the snacks, did you?" The system looked at its feverish host and shuddered. "I only ate some dried fruits. I didn't eat much. I really didn't." The feverish host was filled with murderous intent. "If you dare eat too much, I'll strangle you to death." The system silently looked at the dried mango in its hand. Should it throw it away and destroy the evidence? In any case, he had already bought it. Sooner or later, the host would know that he would strangle it to death. It had to eat more before it died to be worthy of its bones and flesh. Beside the soft bed, Arthur supported his chin with one hand and closed his eyes. His pale face had a faint trace of tiredness. He suddenly opened his eyes vigilantly and found that the sleeping Wei Wei Bai had a pained expression. She seemed to be saying something in her sleep, but it was too chaotic. Arthur couldn't understand it. Was she having a nightmare? Arthur lowered his head and gently touched her face with his fingers. He felt the fever recede. He gently said, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Chapter 943. This sentence made her expression calm down, and the sound of her shallow and steady breathing could be heard. Arthur let out a sigh of relief before lowering his head and kissing her soft and beautiful hair. His expression was surprisingly gentle. The light of the day made him uncomfortably close his eyes. But when he thought of the doctor's words, he resisted the urge to close the curtains. The doctor said that he couldn't force her to drink his blood anymore, although the blood of a prince had the ability to repair the human body. But if it was used on humans who were too weak, It could be effective in the short term, but it was based on overdraft of life. In other words, the more he fed her blood, the shorter her life would be in the future. Humans were truly too weak in front of the blood race with eternal life. And she needed sunlight. The days in the dungeon had worsened her body's weakness. She needed a bright and stable environment. Arthur had never been so careful to raise such a young girl. He was afraid that her fragile, soft, delicate, and beautiful life would disappear because of his carelessness. Liz bent her body and silently appeared behind Arthur. "Your Highness, the information of the interrogation is here. The clerk is also waiting outside." Arthur took the information. He clasped Wei Wei Bai's fingers, kissed them, and said softly, "I'll be back later." This kind of prince was terrifyingly sticky. What was even more frightening was that the young girl didn't wake up at all. Arthur turned his head, and his expression had changed. He stood up and walked out with a cold arrogance on his face. The clerk fearfully told him the process of the interrogation. Arthur's expression was cold. In other words, she didn't join the rebel army. She just accidentally entered the gathering place, and then you deliberately sent her to her death. The clerk didn't dare to say anything. This decision wasn't something small shrimps like them could make. Wasn't this the judgment of Morris Prince? Arthur snorted. "I'm too kind to you. You know that she's my baby, but you still dare to treat her like this." "Clerk, baby, you even sent her to trial. You changed your attitude too quickly." He answered with fear. "Your Highness, this is not something we can decide." Arthur continued to ask as if he didn't hear him. "What happened to her parents?" The clerk said, "I think he was killed by vampires. We haven't investigated it yet." Arthur's face darkened. "You didn't investigate anything, and you convicted her." The clerk trembled in fear. "Your Highness, when you sent her for trial, didn't you tacitly approve of her death? When humans were brought to trial by the vampires, almost all of them died. Even if they were wrongly accused, they would still die. Because humans were too lowly, death was insignificant. Therefore, when Arthur sent her over, they thought that he was going to kill her. Even if he knew that she wasn't a rebel, he still wanted to get rid of her." Arthur also thought of this, and his body felt like it was being pricked by needles. He frowned and thought for a while with a cold face. Just as he was about to raise his hand to get rid of these clerks, suddenly, a familiar sweet smell drifted past his nose. Arthur immediately turned his head, only to see a light blue pajama skirt flash past on the stairs of the hall. It was Wei Wei Bai's nightgown. She heard everything. Wei Wei Bai's footsteps were a little weak. Just as she ran into the corridor, she didn't have time to push open the door. A hand passed over her shoulder and rested on the door, locking her in an embrace. Wei Wei Bai turned around and found Arthur standing in front of her. His face was still expressionless, but his thin lips were tightly pressed together, as if he was enduring something. Chapter 944. She immediately wrapped her arms around herself in an insecure posture. Then she turned her head away to avoid looking at him. Arthur's eyes turned gloomy. He had many ways to force her to look at him, but he couldn't do any of them. He suddenly suppressed his voice and said, "Were your parents killed by vampires?" Wei Wei Bai's body trembled as she looked at him in panic. Her hands gripped her skirt tightly as the corners of her mouth twitched. Finally, she said coldly, "So what if they were? Do you vampires care how a human died?" Arthur's fingers almost broke the door. He held back his frustration and said, "Of course I don't care." Wei Wei Bai looked up and glared at him. She was about to explode. But he continued, "But don't you care? When did they die?" Her parents seemed to have died a long time ago. The fact that she was an orphan was clearly written in the school's records. Wei Wei Bai said, "If you don't care, why are you asking this? Do you think you can take revenge for them?" Arthur repeated, "You care." Wei Wei Bai said, "What does that have to do with you?" Arthur paused and his expression suddenly became gentle. "Of course I care about what you care about." Wei Wei Bai's mouth tightened. She couldn't understand what was wrong with him. Arthur saw that a strand of her long hair fell to her shoulder and couldn't help but comb it. Wei Wei Bai immediately looked at him warily. Her gaze was guarded and uneasy. Arthur's expression darkened. He carefully suppressed the violent emotions in his body. He tried to say gently, "It's my fault for frightening you when I sent you to trial. Don't be angry." He was a grand prince of the blood race, and it was already extremely lowly of him to treat her like this. Wei Wei Bai didn't appreciate it at all. She looked at him with a cold smile. "I thought you couldn't wait to kill me, a sinner who disobeyed you in every way." Arthur's calm eyes showed a trace of intense annoyance. He stared at her as if he had a lot to say. In the end, he only said one sentence. "If you hate vampires because of your parents' death, then I will give you an explanation." With that, he immediately turned around and left. He didn't have the slightest reluctance. But in a place where Wei Wei Bai couldn't see, his calm eyes finally surged with conflicting joy and pain. He clenched his fists, afraid that he would turn around again. He couldn't help but hug her and get close to her. In front of her, his self-control was too weak. Suppressing it became the most difficult thing for him to do. But he also knew that he didn't want to scare her anymore. He didn't want her to cry and have nightmares. When Wei Wei Bai was having dinner, Arthur suddenly walked in wearing a black coat. His long hair was tied up, and his coat was embroidered with gold-rimmed patterns, looking luxurious and exquisite. It made him look even colder and more arrogant. He bent down and picked her up from the chair, not allowing her to refuse. Wei Wei Bai couldn't resist at all and was brought to the hall by him. A few of the lower-ranking members of the Blood Clan were trembling on their knees. Arthur sat on the chair, and Wei Wei Bai sat on his lap. She was trapped in his arms, unable to struggle. "Speak." Those Blood Clan members looked at each other, unwilling to speak. Arthur sneered. He didn't even move, but those Blood Clan members were already lying on the ground in pain. "I'll say we killed them. At that time, we were passing by the slums and suddenly thought of a hunting game, so," another Blood Clan member continued, "so we mistakenly killed a lot of humans." Hunting humans was a hobby of the Blood Clan aristocrats. At the bottom to record this reading. Chapter 945. Often, when the vampires gathered, they would encircle an area where humans lived. Usually, it would be the slums, and then they would start to hunt humans. Whoever killed the most humans would be the winner. Arthur was expressionless and unmoved, but the person in his arms started to tremble. He looked down and saw that her eyes were filled with anger and hatred. This anger made Arthur tense up, and he even felt heartache for the hatred in her eyes. Arthur already knew the truth. He thought for a while before making a decision. "Continue." One of the vampires immediately said, "I've killed too many people. I really can't remember their names." This was the truth. The high and mighty vampires had a hard time remembering the names of humans. This sentence finally ignited the anger of the girl in his arms. She suddenly pushed Arthur fiercely and escaped from his arms. She had already rushed in front of the vampire. She raised her hand and ruthlessly slapped the Blood Clan member without any hesitation. The vampire was stunned after hurting his hand, but it didn't hurt much. After all, a human strength was still too weak to attack a vampire. Wei Wei Bai lowered her head, and her long hair fell. Her pale face was dyed with a bright red, and her round and harmless eyes burst out with an unimaginable light. At this moment, she was like a lush flame that burned people's eyes. Arthur sat up straight, and the careless expression on his face disappeared. This was the first time he had experienced the hatred of humans. It could actually bring such great power. She said word by word, "That's right. Humans are as lowly as ants. You can kill them as you want, but you don't need to remember who we are. We are just pigs, dogs, cows, and sheep in your eyes."
So what if we die?
I still remember how you looked like. At that time, I hid under the bed and saw with my own eyes how you dug out my mother's heart with your fingers and how you killed my father with one kick. At this point, Wei Wei Bai couldn't continue. Her voice was trembling badly, and her eyes were red. She was in pain and despair. "I hate you, you animals." Arthur had already stood up. He never thought that she would be in so much pain. To him, the death of a human was something he did not care about at all. Therefore, he knew that she hated him because her parents were killed by vampires. He looked at the information and found that he didn't kill her by mistake. He heaved a sigh of relief and let her vent her anger on the murderer. That way, she wouldn't hate him. But when he saw the hatred and fury in her eyes, he realized that she might already hate all vampires. Arthur immediately walked over, casually pulled out a sword, and stuffed it into Wei Wei Bai's hand. He held her hand and pointed the sword at the vampire. He was the one who killed your parents. Wei Wei, I killed him with my own hands and freed myself from hatred. This was his goal. He wanted her to let go of her hatred. Wei Wei Bai's fingers were trembling badly. She suddenly said coldly, "Let go of me." Arthur was silent and hesitant. "Let go," she snapped. Ordering a prince around like this was simply courting death. But to everyone's surprise, the prince only hesitated for a moment before letting go and taking a few steps back. He said worriedly, "Don't hurt yourself." Wei Wei Bai tightened her grip on her sword and remained silent. She didn't even turn around to look at him. She walked step by step towards the vampire with her back straight. Then, she raised her sword and threw it out. But she didn't kill the vampire. Then, she didn't even look back as she walked out. Chapter 946. The moonlight outside was cold, and it shone on her. Before she reached the door, she saw Arthur leaning against the door with his arms crossed. His long black coat was draped over his shoulders, looking casual and relaxed. "Why don't you kill your enemy?" Arthur asked in confusion. Wei Wei Bai turned to look at him coldly and suddenly laughed. "Didn't you want to humiliate me? I can't kill him at all." Vampires could always recover, and she couldn't kill vampires with her strength. Arthur sighed. "I'll help you kill him." As long as she raised her sword, he would help her solve it. Wei Wei Bai looked at him expressionlessly, and the confusion in her eyes deepened. She sneered. "What's wrong with you? Aren't you unhappy that I disobeyed you and wanted to kill me? Now that you're acting like this, people who don't know would think that you like me." Arthur was silent for a while before nodding. "A little." Wei Wei Bai. "What?" Arthur. "I like you." The cold moonlight was extremely hazy. The two of them stood under the moonlight, and the silence stretched on. Arthur suddenly couldn't take it anymore. "You should say something." Wei Wei Bai took a few steps back with a look of disbelief. "Say something?" Arthur suddenly came in front of her, held her face with both hands, and kissed her fiercely. Wei Wei Bai was so shocked that she couldn't move. After he finished kissing her, he pursed his lips tightly and said after a long time, "Don't you like me a lot?" He had seen the information at the trial. The clerk had also described the scene at that time. The effect of the self-bleaching agent was irresistible to humans because it had magic power. This was not a power that humans could resist. So what she said was true. She didn't betray him. She just entered that place by mistake. He later heard her conversation with the rebel members. Maybe she wanted to join in at that time. But because he interrupted, she didn't succeed. And she hated vampires and even wanted to join the rebel army because she had a grudge against them. For the first time, Arthur saw in the file that she liked him about it. His mind was in a daze, and then he was ecstatic, but he suppressed it. He was afraid that he had made a mistake. That was why he had found her enemy. All she had to do was take revenge. Would she admit that she liked him then? Wei Wei Bai was in a daze. She repeated foolishly, "I like you?" For the first time, Arthur felt nervous. If it wasn't for the fact that he wasn't sweating, his palms would probably be wet like a disappointing human. He was extremely reserved. "Didn't you say that you like me?" Wei Wei Bai's eyes went blank, and then she panicked. She suddenly retreated, wanting to dodge. "No, I don't like you."
Who told you that? Arthur closed in step by step.
One of them retreated, while the other chased. "Of course you said it yourself. Did you forget what you said when you were interrogated?" Wei Wei Bai was anxious. "Who said that?"
I didn't.
One of the side effects of the self-bleaching agent was that humans would not be able to remember what happened during the period of self-bleaching. Only then did Arthur remember, and his face immediately turned ugly. If she couldn't remember, wouldn't that mean she didn't know that he had confessed to her? Then wouldn't it be too much of a loss for him to say that he liked her just now? Arthur immediately sped up and grabbed her shoulders tightly, not allowing her to escape. Say that you like me. Wei Bai straightened her neck. Scram, I don't like you. Arthur was also angry. I said that I like you. Why didn't you respond to me? Wei Bai opened her eyes. Do I have to like you just because you like me? Arthur. Of course. Wei Bai struggled to break free from his fingers and turned to leave. The man behind her held onto her waist with one hand. He lowered his head in silence, as if he was struggling with something. Is it so difficult to admit that you like me? He complained softly, even feeling wronged. You were the one who confessed first. He nagged endlessly, as if he was not satisfied with her indifference after his confession. Wei Bai finally couldn't take it anymore and shouted in annoyance. I like you, okay? Are you satisfied that the whole world likes you? Arthur was speechless for a moment before softly saying, I don't need the whole world. You are enough. Ding. The male lead's favorability has increased to 70. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. / transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here. Transmigration system. Male god, come here, comma. Chapter 947. A favorability of 70 was actually like a favorability of 90 on a Chinibu vampire. Wei Bai had never seen such a clingy man. What style do you like when you renovate the castle? Arthur dragged her to the front of the castle and pointed at the trees in front. He directly ordered the butler. Girls don't like forests. Cut down the trees and plant roses. Wei Bai, what the hell was with planting roses? She didn't like roses. But before she could say anything, Arthur dragged her to the back again. When you rebuild the damaged room on the 3rd floor, give me a new style. Add more pink lace, make the balcony bigger, and get me a set of white tea table and chairs. It's exquisite and pretty. All girls like it. Wei Bai. I don't like it. Before she could finish, Arthur suddenly waved his hand angrily and scolded the maids and the butler behind him. The style of this castle is not good. It's not the style of a young girl.
Change it for me.
Wei doesn't like it. Wei Bai, she suddenly felt very tired. She didn't want to see a pink castle. It was too scary. Liz asked respectfully behind her. Miss, what style do you like? Is soft and delicate decoration okay? The butler was still the best. Wei Bai looked at her gratefully and said, I like the atmosphere. Arthur's face immediately darkened. How are you on duty? The softness is not enough. The outer walls of the castle are too cold and hard. Paint them all pink. Plant roses in the inner and outer courtyards. Make them pink. Renovate the room. Make the bed warmer. Make it light yellow. Oh, right, the outer walls of the castle are too monotonous. Plant roses. Let the whole castle be filled with flowers. The flowers must be pink. Wei Bai, no, she refused. It was too scary. She didn't want to live in a pink castle full of flowers. Arthur concluded, Wei will like it. Wei Bai, no, I don't. Arthur lowered his head and revealed a gentle but very pressurizing smile. You like it, right? This smile actually contained killing intent. Wei Bai felt like she would be killed if she didn't say she liked him. She compromised. I like it, Arthur said. Yes, I knew you would like it. Wei Bai, so hopeless. The system's face was full of anticipation. I really want to live there. What a romantic castle. Wei Bai, even more hopeless. After deciding on the style of the castle's decoration, Arthur waved his hand, and the maids brought in the clothes one by one. These are all the latest dresses this year. I asked them to send one of each. What kind of dress do you like? Wei Bai looked at the line of maids that were about to leave the castle. The number of dresses was too terrifying. She wanted to be free, so she casually pointed at a dress that was more conservative in color, but had a very smooth design. This one. Arthur looked up and said, "No, this color is too old-fashioned." Wei Bai didn't want to argue with him, so she pointed to a light blue dress that looked dreamy, but not dazzling. Arthur snorted. "The style is old-fashioned."
No.
Wei Bai said to the system, "Why is he so experienced with women's dresses?" The system said, "Who said that men can't have experience with women's dresses? We men have a lot of taste and we have a lot of experience when it comes to women's dresses." Although she didn't think much of the system's boasting, Wei Bai was relieved. She mustered up her courage and said, "Why don't you choose for me?" Transmigration system. Adonis, come here. 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 Download the at https://m/com button at the bottom to record this chapter. Transmigration system. Adonis, come here. Chapter 948. She was pressed against the door. A man's hands were on both sides of her ears, completely trapping her in his arms. He lowered his head, his short black hair glowing. His attitude was gentle, but there was an imperceptible coldness in his eyes. "I heard that you were involved in the chaos of the rebel army. Are you okay?" Wei Bai's eyes flashed with a trace of vigilance. "What rebel army?" "I don't know." She didn't know that Los was one of the leaders of the rebel army. She pretended not to know. Los didn't feel that it was ambiguous to press her against the wall like this at all. He looked worried. "You don't have to guard against me."
I'm just worried about you.
Wei Bai replied calmly, "Thank you for your concern, but the way the president worries is really different." He pulled her into the utility room and pressed her against the wall like this. Those who didn't know better would think that he was a pervert. Los seemed to appreciate her vigilance. His voice was gentle and sincere. "You don't have to guard against me, Wei. I'm someone you can trust." Wei Bai still looked at him coldly, seeming a little nervous. Lothian stroked her hair, only to be slapped in the face by the girl. His face was slapped to the side. Wei Bai said coldly, "I don't like people touching my hair. It's like a pet." The feeling of an owner touching a pet's hair. It was very unpleasant. Los was stunned for a while, feeling his cheeks burning. He didn't withdraw his hand. Instead, the gentleness in his voice became more playful. "Why? Only your owner is allowed to touch you." Wei Bai looked up. The anger in her eyes made her look particularly aggressive. "Are you here to insult me, President Los?" The playfulness on Los's face disappeared and was replaced by helplessness. He let go of his hand and took a few steps back, giving Wei Bai her freedom. "No, I thought you would want to join us." Wei Bai opened the door without hesitation and was about to walk out. "I think there will be more outstanding students joining the student union. After all, the student union's rewards are very generous, aren't they? 3 slots for the embrace. How enviable." These words were full of sarcasm in her mouth. After she finished speaking, she walked out of the storage room. However, she heard a faint voice behind her. "I'm inviting you to join the Anti-Vampire Alliance." Wei Bai stopped in her tracks, but she did not turn around. Los leaned against the door and looked at her seriously. "I know you hate vampires. The last time you appeared at our gathering, didn't you want to join us?" Wei Bai finally looked back at him in disbelief. "It's you." Roth smiled. "Yes, it's me. I'm a small leader in the Anti-Alliance. We suffered heavy losses in the last gathering and need a large number of new members. So, I'd like to invite you to join us." Wei Bai frowned. "Aren't you worried that I will betray you?" Just like that, he revealed his identity. "If you really want to betray me, I'm willing to die. I've never dared to tell you that I like you. I've liked you for 3 years." When he said this, there was no expression on his face, and his voice was incomparably indifferent. However, his eyes seemed to be dyed with light, and there was deep affection in them. He suddenly looked away, blushing slightly. I'm too abrupt. You might not even know me. He acted out the lowly part of having a crush on someone very well. Wei Wei Bai's face showed a trace of shock, but she quickly concealed it and said coldly, "Don't joke around. Also, if I join the Anti-Alliance, it won't be because of you. It's because I know that humans and vampires can't coexist, and I'm a human. It's my duty to fight against vampires." To make it easier for you to read it next time, you can click Save at the bottom to record this reading. Chapter 949. She turned and left after she finished speaking. Her high ponytail was tied with a pink bow, cute and tacky, but it was very harmonious on her. It was not awkward at all. Maybe it was because her eyes were too round. Or maybe it was because her temperament was too cold. Los thought for a while, and suddenly realized that he had put too much thought into Wei Wei Bai. He put away his shy expression, and his face became cold. A blood servant of the prince who hated vampires, if used well, could be a powerful weapon. Wei Wei Bai walked to the corner, expressionless. You can tell he's not a good person. The system said, "Didn't he have a crush on you?" Wei Wei Bai said, "I saw his eyelashes tremble, the smile on his face stiffen, and his eyes don't show any sign of love. He needs to practice lying better." The system said, "Why do I feel like his acting is not bad?" Wei Wei Bai said, "It's because of trash like you that the entertainment industry is deteriorating." Trash system. It's used to the host's attacks and even thinks that it's cute when the host calls it trash. It's all because of the host's love for it. Wei Wei Bai walked halfway and suddenly turned back. Los had put out the bait and was waiting for Wei Wei Bai to take the bait. He knew that Wei Wei Bai hated vampires, so she would definitely join the Anti-Alliance. He just had to instigate her for a while, provoke her anger towards vampires, and then invite her to join suddenly. He turned around vigilantly and saw Wei Wei Bai standing behind him. He immediately put on a gentle smile and was about to speak. Wei Wei Bai put on a smile, clear and firm. "I've thought about it, President. I'm applying to join the Anti-Vampire Alliance." Los was silent for a while, as if he was surprised. He did not expect Wei Wei Bai to suddenly join. She was a blood servant of the prince, and among the humans, she was treated like a noble. No human could resist such temptation. But she gave up so easily. She chose to fight vampires. After Wei Wei Bai finished speaking, her smile disappeared, and she turned to leave. "It's better if we don't get to know each other in school. If I'm exposed in the future, at least I can protect you." Roth stood there in a daze. He waited for the reaction to return. Wei Wei Bai had disappeared at the end of the corridor. Roth was speechless for a long time before he faintly nodded. "You are approved to join." After saying this, Roth showed a gentle smile. His impression of Wei Wei Bai had also changed greatly. She was a good girl. Wei Wei Bai, the green bar has increased again. It's now at 40%. Sure enough, joining the Anti-Vampire Alliance would immediately give him green bars. If you want favorability, you have to rub off Arthur. If you want the green bar value, you can freeload Los.
Perfect.
The system asked, "Aren't you afraid of a split? If you keep rubbing like this, you might break a bone." Wei Wei Bai was as calm as the wind. "Trust me, I'll take care of it. After all, with such a trashy system like you, if I don't pull myself together, I can only drag you to the grave and commit suicide." The system was also calm. "How much does the host love me? Even if you die, you'll drag me down with you." The host and the system both laughed at each other at the same time. Wei Wei Bai had just walked out of the school gate when she heard a cry of surprise. She saw a huge shadow under her feet. She looked up blankly and saw a big black bat suddenly descending. The scary big bat was crawling on the ground. A tall figure walked down gracefully from the bat's wings. His silver hair was tied up neatly. His cold and delicate face was like a work of art, without a single flaw. Download the at https://m/sashu.com// the button at the bottom to record this chapter. Chapter 950. She grabbed Arthur's clothes tightly with both hands. Arthur stopped in the air and had no intention of landing. His voice was very gentle, like a poisonous snake. "Tell me, who is the man who approached you in school?" He smelled the scent of another male human on her body. He must be very close to her to have such a strong scent. Bai Weiwei buried her head in his arms, gritted her teeth, and said with a trembling voice, "I don't know what you're talking about. Today, there are so many people who approached me. Everyone wants to please me. They can't wait to stick to me, just to get your favor." Arthur frowned. "My favor." Weiwei Bai raised her head fiercely, her eyes still trembling with fear. She pulled the corners of her mouth into an ugly smile. "Yes, Your Highness the Prince's favor. As your blood slave, am I not the best target to please? There are even people who pounced on me just to get information about you going out." Arthur thought about how humans turned into vampires for the sake of killing each other in the past. It was possible that they had been sticking to her to please her. So the scent on her body was just some human who didn't know what was good for them and stuck to her to climb up? His fingers were on her back, and he could still feel her trembling in fear. A sense of pity surged in his heart. This is a joke that vampires often do. Sometimes we will give our partners a surprise. For example, we will push her off a building and catch her. Then the women will be very happy. He was talking about the women of the vampires. Weiwei Bai. You idiotic joke. She was so scared that she almost showed her true face. Arthur saw that she was really scared. He thought for a moment and suddenly lowered his head, revealing his neck. "I'll let you take a bite." Weiwei Bai looked at him like he was an idiot. Arthur explained patiently, "If your partner is angry, let her take a few bites and she will be happy." Weiwei Bai finally realized that the words were wrong. "Partner?" Arthur looked at her calmly, but his eyes were complicated, expectant, and hesitant. "Tonight, there will be a sacred blood banquet. The 13th elder, as well as the nobles, will be attending. If you have a partner, you must bring your partner with you." Weiwei Bai was still at a loss. Arthur said softly but firmly, "Tonight, you will accompany me." Weiwei Bai said, "I don't." Arthur didn't allow her to refuse. He didn't even give her a chance to speak. He raised his chin coldly. "If you say no, I'll just joke with you again." With that, he loosened his grip and was about to throw her out. Weiwei Bai immediately shouted, "I will participate. I will definitely participate." Arthur tightened his arms and revealed a smug smile. "It seems that you are also looking forward to this banquet. Let's go back." Weiwei Bai was hugged tightly by him and almost suffocated by his strength. She fiercely said to the system, "Next time when you torture this bastard, remember to remind me not to be soft-hearted." The system retorted, "When did you become soft-hearted?" Weiwei Bai thought about it and agreed. When had she ever been soft-hearted? The sacred blood banquet was the most important banquet for the blood race. All the most powerful and honorable blood breeds would be present. After the banquet, the Sacred Blood Conference would begin, and the true leader would be chosen. Arthur was seen as the most likely blood breed to become the leader. That was why his presence was very eye-catching, especially the human beside him, who was even more eye-catching. That was because it wasn't appropriate for a human to appear in such an occasion. But Arthur had a human a partner with him. Just like that, he walked into the banquet. Download the at https://m/com button at the bottom to record this chapter. Chapter 951. It was unbelievable. Weiwei Bai wore an evil pink banquet dress and felt that she was as eye-catching as a Christmas turkey. So when those vampires stared at her strangely, she actually felt that it was natural. Who wouldn't be surprised when looking at a pink Christmas tree? Arthur wore a complicated aristocratic costume, a white man's suit with golden patterns on the collar and cuffs. He bent his arm and let Weiwei Bai hold him as they walked into the hall. His posture was elegant and impeccable, and his expression was arrogant and cold. Only when he looked at her could there be a trace of gentleness in his eyes. Arthur. Moore limped over with the aid of his crutch. Then he saw Wei Wei Bai, and his expression changed. He whispered to Arthur, "You are too brazen. Can't you wait until the Sacred Blood Conference to bring this human out?" Arthur sized up his leg coldly and snorted. Moore shook 3 times. He found his leg, but it was missing a bone. It would take time to grow it back. Now that he saw Arthur, his whole body hurt. Moore's tone was much weaker. "When you become the leader, no one can resist you as long as you want. Why can't you bear with it?" Bringing it out at this time would reduce Arthur's votes. Arthur said calmly, "I can't bear it. I waited 100 years for a woman to make me excited. If I bear with it for a second, I will be dismembered. If anyone is not convinced, I accept a one-on-one fight." Wasn't this bullying? Let someone fight him one-on-one. Fighting one-on-one with the vampire's strongest martial artist, he was looking for trouble. Moore turned and left helplessly. "Up to you. Sooner or later, you'll play yourself to death." Arthur said, "There is no one who can play me to death," he said confidently halfway, but suddenly hesitated. He glanced at Wei Wei Bai, who lowered her head and didn't know what to do. Then he pursed his lips and didn't dare to say too much. Vampires were a race that was good at enduring when they were full. Today's vampires were all elegant and well-dressed. Although everyone's cold eyes would size up Wei Wei Bai. But no one came forward to greet him. The greetings were all directed at Arthur. His attitude towards Bai Weiwei was like treating air. The opening dance of the banquet was about to begin. The music was cheerful and pleasant. The ladies would walk to the waiting area on the other side, and then the men would come forward to invite their dance partners. Arthur loosened his grip. "Wait for me." Wei Wei Bai had no choice but to walk to the waiting area and sit on the sofa. The female vampire beside her looked at her with disdain and indifference. Then, she quietly distanced herself from her. Even if she was brought in by Prince Arthur, no one really thought that Bai Weiwei had the status of a partner. How could a mere blood servant have the right to sit with a group of great nobles like them? The banquet was lavishly decorated. The revelry of the night was just about to begin. When the music reached its climax, the male vampire slowly walked over. She reached out to invite her dance partner. Wei Wei Bai watched as the female vampires were invited away one by one. She was still sitting there in a daze. The system said, "The male protagonist is being held back. It's the prince who is competing with him for the leadership. He's very capable. He wants Arthur to give up on you and dance with his sister. Then, Arthur will smoothly take the position of leader." This was a very tempting suggestion. After all, Arthur's biggest competitor was the prince. 3 princes, if the remaining 2 supported him. He would be the undisputed king. Suddenly, the music of the banquet quieted down. The prince looked up and said loudly, "Let Arthur and his partner begin the opening dance." He looked very happy. It seemed that he had reached an agreement with Arthur to dance with his sister. Arthur smiled gently. He tidied up his sleeves and slowly walked to the waiting area. On the sofa beside Wei Wei Bai, a reserved and arrogant female vampire sat upright. As Arthur walked in, she trembled with excitement. Arthur walked in front of her. Everyone looked at them expectantly. Duo Deng is a pair of beautiful women. As for Wei Wei Bai, who was that? He didn't know her. Wei Wei Bai looked at this scene and couldn't help but think. Could it be that this vampire suddenly had a brain and knew that he had to be the leader first before he could talk about love? Just as she thought so, a cold hand held her warm fingers. She looked up and saw this handsome silver-haired man. He lowered his head and looked at her gently. It was as if his eyes were filled with her. "Do you want to dance, my princess?" Ding! The male protagonist's favorability is at 80. Download the at https://m Sashu. Calm the. Chapter 952. Wei Wei Bai did not answer, but was pulled up by this pair of hands that would not allow her to refuse. Then, he lifted her arm and brought her to the dance floor. The lights around them were dazzling. Wei Wei Bai seemed to hear the sound of many blood breeds gnashing their teeth. She was really hated by the blood breeds. But the person who started all this hugged her waist, lowered his head, and whispered in her ear, "Do you know how to dance?" Wei Wei Bai put her hand on his shoulder with some effort. There was a difference in height between them. She said awkwardly, "Not really." Blood Breed's music was obviously different from human social dance. Arthur hugged her, and with one step, he had already turned around elegantly. Then he held her waist without any hesitation, and if it was a complicated dance, he would lift her up lightly and let her feet leave the ground for a few seconds to complete a move. Then he put her down again. Was this a marionette dance? Wei Wei Bai's face was stiff, and under the watchful eyes of the Blood Breeds, she finished the dance with Arthur. His last action was to lower his head and kiss her cheek. The Prince Charming, who was always indifferent, was smiling gently. Their silhouettes were under the gorgeous lights. They were a perfect match. "You're so cute." His eyes were soft, and his voice was full of laughter. Wei Wei Bai looked up, and a helpless expression flashed across her pale face. Then she pushed him away, turned around, and left. Arthur saw her expression, and his expression became even gentler. She was not indifferent to him. Wei Wei Bai walked to the waiting area and took a break after dancing for a while. The system reminded her, "There's going to be a fight later. Be careful." Wei Wei Bai, fight? Is it from Roth's side, or the Prince Charming who was slapped in the face by Arthur because he failed to deliver a girl? The system. It's Roth. The members of the Anti-Vampire Alliance gathered 70 to 80% of their elites from various cities, and they want to wipe out the Blood Breeds today. Wei Wei Bai, humans are too weak compared to vampires. What did they do? The system said, use poison and mana bombs. Under the system's painstaking explanation, she finally found out that the magic bomb was an extremely powerful bomb. In any case, this kind of bomb's power did not have a large range, but to the Blood Clan, one explosion was enough to kill one. This was because the magic bomb could temporarily prevent vampires from regaining their ability to regenerate. During this time, he would be able to kill a large number of vampires with his fireballs. It was said that many bombs had been buried around the castle where the banquet was held. Wei Wei Bai supported her chin with her hand and began to think. That's not right. I feel that Arthur will definitely be able to charge out. When that happens, those humans outside will be slaughtered by him alone. He had seen how Arthur attacked others. It was akin to an atomic bomb explosion. Once the encirclement was set up, the people within the encirclement would die one by one. Furthermore, it was an indiscriminate attack. It was like a bug in the system. Could it be that they have some sort of ultimate move to deal with Arthur? Wei Wei Bai was still thinking about whether she could use this plan. The system suddenly said, I saw the message from the main system. If you participate in this plan, you will receive 30% of the green bar value. Wei Wei Bai's eyes lit up. To what extent is participation? The system said, it's probably to assist the humans in completing this plan to deal with the Blood Clan. You will receive the reward if you successfully annihilate more than 80% of the Blood Clan. Wei Wei Bai frowned. This was too difficult. // You will be able to see it the next time you open the bookshelf. Chapter 953. But if she missed this opportunity, with the speed at which Arthur's favorability increased, she was not far from self-destructing on the spot. Wei Wei Bai raised her head to look at the group of bloodlings. Arthur was standing beside Moore, and opposite him was the prince just now. That prince seemed to be questioning something. Arthur, however, just slightly raised the corner of his mouth, as if he was not interested in him. He seemed to sense her gaze and turned his cold face around. Under the light, his face was as white as porcelain, and his lips were as red as a rose. He saw her. The frosty indifference on his face disappeared and was replaced by a smile. Then, a maid beside him came to Arthur respectfully with a plate of food. Arthur glanced down, as if he was picking at something. Then, he took the plate, not caring about the ugly expression of the other prince who had been slapped in the face. He took a step forward and walked towards her. Arthur came in front of Wei Wei Bai and put the plate on the small table in front of her. There were some freshly squeezed fruit juice and some human desserts on it. Arthur picked up a small piece of cream strawberry and pressed it on Wei Wei Bai's lips. There is no human food here. I ordered them to bring it here. Eat some. His attitude was considerate, but his actions were very domineering, because he stuffed the food into Wei Wei Bai's mouth, not allowing her to refuse.
Eat more.
You are too thin. I will let you nourish yourself during this period. You must eat supper in the future and eat more meat. Wei Wei Bai frowned. Are you feeding pigs? Arthur's attitude was calm as he took another piece of high-calorie cream cake and stuffed it into her mouth. No, I want to fatten you up. After all, a demi-vampire's body will never change after the embrace. Although you're already cute enough, your body is unbelievably soft and slender. I'm still greedy. I want to make your face rounder and healthier. Wei Wei Bai seemed to be struck by lightning. She looked at him blankly. Sub-vampire? Sub-vampires were humans who were turned into vampires after being embraced by bloodlings. They had eternal life and were no different from vampires. However, the inferior blood race had a very fatal flaw. It was the vampire who couldn't resist the embrace. In other words, if Wei Wei Bai were to become a sub-vampire, she would become a vampire. She would forever live under Arthur's control. She would be suppressed by the blood breed's level and be unable to resist her father, who gave her the embrace. This was the heavy price one had to pay to obtain eternal life. Wei Wei Bai thought of a key point. Slagstem. How did I die after being stuck here for 6 months? The system replied. Struck by lightning. Wei Wei Bai. Couldn't there be a more romantic way to die? She decided that she would kill herself in this plane. She would never let the original way of dying happen again. If I turn into a blood kindred because of the embrace, what if the lightning doesn't kill me? That was the key point. He had become a vampire. If one was immortal, they would not die from illness. If one's body was strong, they would not die even if they were hit by a car, drowned in water, slashed by knives, or struck by lightning. The system replied, if you really become a vampire, you will not die after 6 months. At that time, there will be a mission for you to kill yourself. If you fail, there will be a terrible punishment. Wei Wei Bai refused to hear what the terrible punishment was. Arthur's red eyes darkened. Yes, I will give you eternal life, an ageless body, and the position of my partner. // Chapter 954. Wei Wei Bai opened her mouth and didn't wait for her to say anything. I won't accept your rebuttal. You don't have any right to decide on this matter. I'm just informing you, not discussing it with you. Arthur's expression was gentle, but his voice was unusually strong and scary. He reached out and held her fingers, approached her, and kissed her lips. The cold breath made Wei Wei Bai shrink back involuntarily. Soon you won't be afraid of the cold anymore. Arthur smiled happily. Wei Wei Bai didn't even have a chance to speak. This guy in front of her didn't listen to others at all. Once he made a decision, he would just inform her. One look, and she could tell that he had a strong desire to control. She couldn't imagine how strong he would be after 100 favorability points. Wei Wei Bai shivered. She didn't want to live in a castle full of control freaks forever. Arthur picked up a fork. Okay, we have to finish all these. I'll go over and say hello. Then we can go back. With that, Arthur turned and left. Wei Wei Bai ate some cake without tasting it. She couldn't stand the sweetness and threw the fork aside. Then she got up and went to the bathroom. Just as she finished washing her hands and was about to go out, a hand appeared behind her shoulder. It pressed down on the door. Although the system reminded her that the president was hiding in the bathroom. But when these people pressed people against the wall, did they all do it silently? She gathered her emotions and suddenly turned around, looking at the man who appeared behind her warily. Ross's hair was dyed dark brown. He was wearing a waiter's uniform, and his body was very cold. It seemed that he used some special method to disguise himself as a vampire. He smiled at her. Wei Wei Bai, I have a mission to trouble you with. Wei Wei Bai's pupils shrank, and her fingers clutched her sleeves tightly. She took a deep breath. "What do you need me to do?" Ross stretched out his hand, and two small and thin syringes appeared in his palm. The red one is an anesthetic that makes vampires lose their mobility. It can paralyze vampires of the prince rank for about 10 minutes. Wei Bai finally knew what Ross was planning. They came to destroy the castle without fear. Because she was there, she had to deal with Arthur. As long as Arthur lost his mobility for a period of time, the plan to destroy the castle would succeed. Wei Bai frowned. "I'm not fast enough. He can stop me." Los smiled ambiguously and suddenly approached her. His breath was as cold as that of the vampires. He said softly, "You must have a way, a woman's way." Wei Bai blushed and turned her face away. "Watch yourself." Los immediately corrected his attitude. "All right, this black syringe is the kiss of death. As long as it is injected into a vampire's body, he will fall into an eternal slumber, unable to wake up." It was no different from being dead. It was very easy to kill a prince who was always asleep. Wei Bai looked at the syringe in his hand, and an intense struggle appeared on her face. "I'll put him to eternal sleep." Ross stuffed the syringe into her hand. "You are our hope. As long as you get rid of Arthur, then the human race will be able to recover. We have been oppressed for too many years and have been turned into vampires' domestic pigs for too long. I don't want our descendants to still live in the vampire's shadow." These words made Wei Bai suddenly tighten her grip on the syringe in her hand. Roth let out a sigh of relief, knowing that she had agreed. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. This matter is very dangerous. You have to be extremely careful. If in the end, you really don't have a chance, crossover system. Adonis, come here and read the full article at https://www.
Sashu.
Download Transmigration System. Adonis, come here and read this on your phone. https://m. Sashu. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on the button at the bottom to record your reading record. You will be able to see it the next time you open the bookshelf. Chapter 955. Los hesitated for a moment and finally said, "Just give up." Wei Bai looked up a little surprised. Los let go of her. "Okay, you can go now. Once you're done with Arthur, quickly go to the bathroom. I've already opened an escape route in the bathroom." Wei Bai's footsteps were a little hesitant, but in the end, she turned around and opened the door. Los's voice came again. "If you don't have a chance to do it, then when the battle starts, pretend that you don't know about this plan and follow Arthur." At least she wouldn't die when she was with Arthur. Wei Bai was silent for a moment before saying coldly, "Just don't die yourself. You still have time to worry about others." With that, she lifted her feet and left without hesitation. Wei Bai returned to the banquet and looked for Arthur. She found that he wasn't there. Moore saw her like a little pitiful girl in an environment full of vampires. He smiled a little nastily, then shook a glass of blood and walked behind her. "Little blood slave, are you looking for your master?" Wei Bai saw that it was him and immediately took a few steps back with a look of disdain. Moore didn't mind her disdain. "Your master is now with Duchess Sang'er. Maybe Arthur will change his mind and kick you out to marry Sang'er." With that, he pointed to the lounge behind the banquet. Wei Bai snorted. "What does it have to do with me, who he marries?" Her tone was so sour that one could smell jealousy. Moore wasn't angry. He shook the glass of blood wine and narrowed his eyes dangerously. "Your identity is just a blood slave. If one day Arthur doesn't want you, I'll be the first to suck your blood dry." Wei Bai's face paled in fright. She quickly turned around and ran to the lounge. Moore's face turned cold. "Really, how can you be tempted by a human? If this continues, the votes won't be enough." If only Wei Bai could leave on her own accord. Wei Bai walked to the door and saw that it was half open. A female voice pleaded, "Arthur, I've loved you for so many years. Can't you look at me? I can't even compare to a lowly human?" Arthur was indifferent. Yes, I can't compare. The prince's sister, sang Air, couldn't help but say loudly, how can I not compare to you? I can give you the ultimate enjoyment. My brother can support you to become a king. I can give you anything. Arthur. Oh, no need. This rejection made it impossible for there to be any ambiguity between them. Arthur's voice sounded with some disdain. Also, put on some clothes. This dried-up body of a few hundred years is too disgusting. Besides, you're 200 years older than me. I'm just a baby in front of you. Don't you think you're molesting a minor? This was a blow. An underage baby who was like a psychopath. Wei Wei Bai suddenly pondered. Compared to Arthur, who was 100 years old, was she a newborn baby? She stole a glance and saw Xander standing naked in front of Arthur. That white body was very well proportioned and good-looking. Why would he dislike this? Sang Air suddenly realized that Wei Wei Bai was standing at the door. Shame flashed across her face. Then she pulled the cloak over, wrapped herself up, and turned to leave. When she brushed past Wei Wei Bai, she gave her a vicious look. Wei Wei Bai was calm. Why did a woman have to make things difficult for another woman? Why didn't she make things difficult for a man together? An arm suddenly pulled her into the room. Arthur raised her face, a trace of grievance on his face. Just now, a woman wanted to molest me. Wei Wei Bai. You're so strong. She can't molest you. Arthur. She's a few hundred years older than me. She's stronger than me. Wei Wei Bai was skeptical. Really? Arthur put away the grievance on his face. It's fake. My level is higher than hers. Then he looked at her anxiously. Wei Wei Bai was confused. Aren't you going to comfort me? She felt that Sang Air was more miserable and in need of comfort. Arthur. My eyes are very uncomfortable. I saw something dirty.
Kiss them.
Wei Wei Bai hesitated, as if she was hesitating about something. Arthur, however, put his hands behind his back and bent down obediently, putting his face in front of her. Kiss them. Such an exquisite and handsome face, so pitiful and pleading. As if bewitched, she couldn't help but kiss his eyes. But before she could leave, he raised his chin slightly and kissed her lips. This kiss was lingering and gentle. Arthur could feel the sweetness of her warm lips. He wanted to have this sweetness forever. Her hand suddenly stroked his neck gently. Arthur didn't stop her and even indulged her intimate actions. But in the next second, he could have stopped her, but he quickly patted her hand and he paused. This kind of strength would break the bones in her hand. This hesitation. The syringe in her hand had already pierced his skin. The cold hit and froze his body. It also froze the tenderness and sweetness in his eyes. Chapter 956. Arthur's body began to numb. This was an anesthetic specially developed by the Anti-Vampire Alliance to deal with vampires. Arthur had seen this anesthetic before. He was very sure. It was something that only the rebel army could obtain. His hand tightly grasped her wrist, and his eyes were filled with murderous intent. So, from the beginning, you were on the rebel army's side? From the beginning, she only approached him to gain his trust. And then deal with him? This was the first time Arthur trusted a human so much. It was also the first time he was slapped in the face so hard. His red eyes were filled with killing intent, and there was a trace of uncontrollable sadness. The pain was so extreme that he didn't feel anything. He hated the people who betrayed him the most. No, it was the people who ruined his feelings. Ding! The male lead's favorability is at 80, 75, 60. The notifications kept ringing as the favorability dropped. Wei Wei Bai's hand was gripped so tightly that the bones were about to break, but her expression seemed to be frozen, and her eyes were empty and helpless. It was as if the person who gave him the needle wasn't her. How could she still look at him with such an innocent expression? Humans were really weak and cunning. They didn't know what was good for them, and they deserved to die. Arthur's body slowly leaned on her and slid to the ground. He also lost the strength to grab her wrist. Wei Wei Bai seemed to be shocked and immediately reached out to grab his sleeve. She finally reacted. Her eyes were filled with tears. Then she lowered her head to look at him. Seeing his cold and ruthless expression, she was a bit scared. Arthur forced out a cold smile. "You're still scared?" Wei Wei Bai seemed to think of something, and her fingers trembled as she took out a black needle. Arthur had been dealing with the rebel army for a long time, so how could he not know about the kiss of death? This was a precious poison that only the rebel army's higher-ups could get. It was researched internally by the rebel army, so no one could get it except the rebel army. Wei Wei Bai held the needle as if she was holding something terrible, and a fierce struggle appeared on her face. "This thing will only make you sleep." Arthur looked at her coldly, but grief began to appear in his eyes. He didn't speak, and didn't bother to beg. He didn't even bother to threaten him. Wei Wei Bai was a rebel and had betrayed him. The fact that she wanted him to fall into an eternal slumber made him lose his will to fight. Wei Wei Bai repeated, "You only know how to sleep. You are a vampire. You are the vampire I hate the most." He seemed to be convincing himself. He kept convincing himself. She bent down, lowered her head, and hugged his neck with both hands, pressing him into her warm embrace. His movements were gentle and careful. However, the black syringe in her hand was already placed by his neck. There was only a fine line between eternal slumber. Arthur's face was buried in her chest. She couldn't see his expression, but his voice suddenly weakened. "Have you ever liked me?" The syringe in her hand paused. She maintained this posture for a while before lowering her eyes. Tears fell from her eyes without warning. "I don't like you. I won't like you. As long as you disappear from my life, I will definitely not like you." His voice almost broke when he said this. More and more tears fell onto his forehead and neck. The killing intent and madness in Arthur's heart were suppressed bit by the tears. He couldn't raise his head because his whole body was numb. He could only feel the trembling of her suppressed sobs and the warmth of her tears. She was in pain. She was in so much pain that she couldn't even control her movements. Chapter 957. The black syringe missed him by a little bit, but she didn't dare to stab him. A strange emotion surged in Arthur's heart, as if he was unexpectedly at a loss. But more than that, it was pity that she was crying so pitifully. Ding! The male lead's favorability is at 70. The madly dropping favorability started to rise back up. Arthur leaned against her body and suddenly felt her push him away bit by bit. He also weakly lay on the red carpet. But Wei Wei Bai's black syringe didn't fall on him. If it was the rebel army, how could she miss such a good opportunity? Next time, she wouldn't have this opportunity to kill him. And once he regained his revenge, it was impossible that she didn't know what would happen to her. He struggled to look up. His scarlet eyes reflected Wei Wei Bai's pale face. She stared at him blankly, holding the syringe. Suddenly, she smiled. Her smile was indescribably fragile and painful. "We are enemies, Arthur. Humans and vampires can't coexist. I've long wanted to join the Anti-Alliance, because I don't want to be a pet, a prey. I want to be a person with dignity. Do you know how it feels to have nightmares? I will never forget the scene of my parents being killed in front of my eyes, and I could only cover my mouth and hide under the bed." She lowered her head in pain, her bangs covering her misty eyes. "Even if you get those culprits for me to take revenge, I will never be able to get rid of the shadow of that time." Wei Wei Bai lowered her head and smiled bitterly. "I don't want to be a vampire. I don't want to be a monster that can only live by sucking the blood of my own kind." When she said the word monster, she finally looked up. Her eyes were calm and firm, like a bird that had broken out of its cage, full of hope for freedom. Her every word was so firm. "I will always stand on the side of humans. This has nothing to do with hatred. I just want to see my future children live under the sun, and not be afraid of the attacks of predators." After saying that, she revealed a faint smile. This smile was relieved and gentle. It made her feel as if she was bathed in light, warm to the heart. Arthur was speechless. His eyes never left her face. He had never seen this side of her before. She was no longer resisting in a sorry state, nor was she as terrified as when she was imprisoned by him. It was as if his little blood slave had grown up overnight. She had broken free of the shackles that bound her and intended to fly to a wider sky. He had left his former master far behind. She was obviously going to abandon him.
But he thought she was damn dazzling.
Ding. The male lead's favorability is at 80. Wei Wei Bai turned around. I'm leaving. There are still 5 minutes before the explosion. By then, the anesthesia on your body won't wear off. You'll die here. She was clearly pretending to be calm when she said this. But he could hear the trembling of pain. Arthur's bloodshot eyes were half closed, and his silver hair covered half of his face. It was exquisite and eerie. He used all his strength to force his numb tongue to say a few words. Needles, why don't you kill? There was clearly a syringe that could make him fall into an eternal sleep, so why didn't he use it on him? If she was truly doing this for the sake of humanity, she should have gotten rid of this scourge first. Wei Wei Bai heard his words and knew what he was going to ask. She stood by the door with her back straight. Under the light, her back seemed more fragile and sorrowful. Finally, she lowered her voice and said softly, because I couldn't bear to do it, crossover system. Adonis, come here and read the full article at https://www.
Sashu.
Download Transmigration system. Adonis, come here and read it on. Transmigration system. Adonis, come here. Chapter 958. She couldn't help but turn around, the strong love in her eyes pouring out. Wei Wei Bai smiled, the pain and sadness in her eyes not much less than Arthur's. I liked you, but I can't like you. I can't kill the man I like with my own hands. If you died in the explosion, she almost couldn't finish the sentence, because the calm on her face was completely occupied by sadness. She was afraid that he would see her, so she immediately turned around and left, leaving behind the last sentence. That's what you deserve, I won't be sad for you. Arthur watched as she ran away from him. It was always like this. When she ran, there was no hesitation at all. He moved his fingers and found that the effect of the anesthetic began to wear off. An anesthetic that could affect a prince for 10 minutes. For him, 5 minutes was barely enough. If she stayed even a minute longer, he would be able to catch her. Like me, his lips and tongue began to recover, and a cold sneer sounded. Like me, yet you want to leave me. Dignity? What is human dignity? I can make all the vampires bow down in front of you. Isn't that dignity enough? Arthur's expression began to slowly distort. Your child in the future? You won't have children. Where will you get children? And you want to find a wild human man to give birth to? Vampires couldn't have children. The reproduction of vampires relied on the huge ancient magic reproduction array. It would create something out of nothing, continuing the bloodline of a powerful vampire from before. But this situation was very rare. These vampires were all pureblood nobles. This was how he was born with the most powerful primogenitor bloodline. He didn't need to think about what humans were as long as they were food, and the most disgusting food. He also didn't need to think about whether human traders could be successful. Anyway, they would be destroyed by him in the end. It wasn't easy for him to fall in love with her, but she ruthlessly trampled on his feelings. Sure enough, he still hated humans the most. His fingers suddenly moved, and a powerful force appeared. The red wind blade smashed the entire room. In the center of the violent force, Arthur, who broke free from the anesthetic, slowly stood up. His face was filled with rage. His face was snow-white, his eyes were red, and his teeth were sharp. His feet were stepping on the offensive magic circle. The Blood Clan's tyrannical and brutal aura suddenly surged. Arthur reached out and touched the door. The door began to shatter and disappear. Amidst the bloody light blade, he revealed a cold smile. Wei Wei, with your weak personality, how are you qualified to resist us invaders for the sake of humanity's dawn? He could kill him, but he couldn't bear to do so. He was really too disappointing. If she was one of his soldiers, he would have killed her. Naive and simple-minded, letting go of the last chance to kill him, it would be impossible to kill him in the future. You should be a canary in my palm.
You deserve to be imprisoned by me.
If she liked him, she should act like she liked him. Instead of running away from him like this, he didn't want this kind of love that was similar to pity. If he wanted something, he would take it himself. Not killing him was one of the things she regretted the most. The door and the wall were all shattered. Arthur walked out of the shattered dust. The Blood Clan prince who calmed the internal strife and suppressed the external strife with one hand. He swept away the decadent calm of his long sleep. Once again, he appeared in front of all the Blood Clan with a bloody and boiling murderous aura. The wine with the anesthetic made many of the Blood Clan lie flat. The humans began to attack the castle. Chapter 959. Fireballs were everywhere. Arthur walked into the battlefield with a calm expression and began his massacre. Humans were just a bunch of pitiful insects. The food rebelled against the master. They really overestimated themselves. Bai Weiwei brushed up the favorability to 80 and immediately ran away. Anyway, she tried to get both green bars and favorability. It would be best if he could fill up both of them before he did the splits. System. Anesthetics don't work on the male lead. He's starting to recover. Weiwei Bai. I should have gotten more anesthetics. I'm in such a hurry. I'm going to wait in the little black room when I'm caught. Once in the little black room, don't even think about getting green bars. Whether or not he could survive was a difficult matter. 80 favorability, plus Arthur's control freak and Shinibu attitude. He might not take the sweet and affectionate route anymore. He might go from love to hate, or love to death. He might kill her and make her into a specimen to display his love. Thinking of that scene, Weiwei Bai shivered. She ran even faster. She was used to running, so she was very experienced. She bypassed many obstacles and finally saw the door of the bathroom. A cold white light suddenly shot towards her back. The system immediately shouted, "Move, Weiwei." Weiwei Bai instinctively trusted the system. She dodged to the left and slammed into the wall. The white light that attacked her also disappeared into the air. After the white light disappeared, an elegant figure appeared. Sang Er had a resentful expression on her face. "Where are you running to?" "Weiwei Bai. I need to go to the toilet. I'm going to pee my pants." Sang Er. Her love rival was too vulgar. She didn't know how to fight back. Her expression twisted a few times before she finally rushed in front of her. She grabbed her collar and lowered her head to threaten her. "You lowly human, what right do you have to stand beside Arthur?"
He's mine.
"Weiwei Bai. Yours, all yours." To be honest, if it wasn't for the strategy, who would want a Chinibu like Arthur? He would die young. Do you know how many years I have loved him? At that time, he had only been born for 3 years, but he was already the strongest warrior of the blood race. He was so handsome, so cold, so powerful, so noble. Sang Er fell into a crazy and brainless fangirl mode. He used at least 100 idioms to express his love for her. Weiwei Bai was dumbfounded. She glanced at the time. In another 2 minutes, this place would explode. There was no time to listen to the old woman's foot-binding nagging. Weiwei Bai's eyes sharpened. He suddenly leaned in front of her and wanted to kiss her mouth. Sang Er was stunned. Weiwei Bai took the opportunity to insert the black needle into her neck. Vampires were terrifyingly fast, and there was no way she could outrun them. He could only create a diversion so that Sang Er would not be able to react in time. Sang Er was knocked down, his face full of disbelief. Weiwei Bai heartlessly turned around and ran into the bathroom. When she found the escape tunnel, she immediately stepped into it. At this moment, the castle shook violently. What was going on? The attack was brought forward? No, the explosion came from outside the castle. Total destruction? The system said, "Your strategy target has resurrected with full HP. He's coming to catch you." Oh my god, he's going to do a split. Weiwei Bai's original plan was to knock down Arthur. She would take the opportunity to escape and meet up with the anti-alliance, then hide for a while. She wanted to increase the green bars and reduce Arthur's anger, then start the second round of strategy. But Arthur was too strong. so she unsealed it ahead of time. Chapter 960. If she didn't run faster, she would feel that something was wrong. Wei Wei Bai finally ran out of the castle. Outside was a dark forest. The castle had already fallen into a fierce fight. Those who were lying in ambush in the forest were the outer members of the Anti-Alliance. They saw a human who was also Wei Wei Bai running out. Maybe it was Roth's order, but someone quickly came over. "Miss Wei Wei Bai, come with me. President Roth asked us to ensure your safety." Wei Wei Bai couldn't care about anything else and could only speed up to catch up with the other person. But after running for a few steps, a fire suddenly broke out in the forest. This fire was especially strange. There was no wind, and it was burning fiercely in such a humid environment. Humans could only die in this kind of fire. Those who were lying in ambush in the forest immediately rushed out while coughing. But the outside was sealed off. The vampire guards quickly appeared and had already sealed off the outside of the forest. Once humans went over, they would be torn apart. All the remaining members of the Anti-Alliance had no choice but to gather together. Where's President Roth? Seems like he's in a tough battle at the castle. Didn't they say that Arthur was held back? Why did he suddenly appear? Who can hold him back? It's already a miracle to hold him back for a few minutes. Are we just going to be burned to death like this? Some people cried on the spot. Those who were lying in ambush in the forest were not the core members, and there were some who couldn't withstand the pressure. Suddenly, a cold voice echoed in the forest through amplification magic. "Wei Wei Bai, come out yourself, or I'll go in and find you." This was a voice. It was the ferocious blackened version of Arthur. The system comforted her. "Why don't you go out and die a better death? The burnt body is black and ugly." Wei Wei Bai thought about it. Being burnt to death was indeed ugly. She wanted to die beautifully. Bah! She was almost dragged into the ditch by the garbage system. She wanted to live. That voice continued. "As long as Wei Wei Bai walks out, I'll let you go." This voice was like a demon, but also like the sound of nature. If they could live, who wouldn't want to live? Especially the outer members of the Anti-Alliance, they didn't have the strong will of the core members. If they could sacrifice an outsider to save so many members, then the faces of several members immediately turned cold. They immediately appeared behind Wei Wei Bai, grabbed her, and ran out. "If we hand her over, we'll be able to protect all of us. The president will definitely agree. Aren't you afraid it's a trap? Even if it's a trap, we still have to jump in. The fire is coming." Wei Wei Bai was sold by a bunch of people who wanted to live. On the outskirts of the forest, the grim vampire guards stood beside the trees. Come and kill a human. They were Arthur's personal guards. They rarely appeared, but once the prince summoned them, this group of vampire soldiers would become the nightmare of every enemy. Wei Wei Bai was dragged out of the forest by a group of people. Those vampires actually didn't attack them. The members of the Anti-Alliance heaved a sigh of relief. They pushed Bai Wei forward, pushing her towards the vampire's side. Then they scattered in all directions and started running away. Sacrificing Wei Wei Bai in exchange for the lives of so many people was worth it. Wei Wei Bai fell to the ground. She was in a sorry state. Her hair was messy, and her gorgeous dress was torn and dirty. She seemed to be in a daze, but she still struggled to get up. But she suddenly paused and didn't dare to raise her head. A cold voice that was as clear as ice resounded. "Do you like it? This kind of betrayal, giving up everything you have and trampling on my dignity and feelings. All for this kind of human? Wei Wei Bai, this is a split and even a fracture." This voice, this murderous intent, could 80 favorability points be exchanged for a life? Arthur's fingers were long and terrifyingly sharp. He gently lifted her face. The soft and pitiful girl trembled in his palm. Her eyes were filled with panic and vulnerability, as well as helplessness from being betrayed. She was bullied to this extent the moment he let go. Arthur's fingernails slid to her fair and slender shoulders. He pressed hard, and blood flowed out from under his fingers. He lowered his head and kissed the blood on her shoulders. His scarlet lips curled into a cold smile. Humans are such ugly and stupid creatures. Because of these people, you actually don't like me and only want to kill me. His words contained a sharp murderous intent. Chase after them and kill all the people who escaped from the forest just now. Wei Wei trembled. She seemed to be frightened by his murderous intent. But Arthur gently pressed down on her hair and comforted her gently by her ear. Don't be afraid. How can I bear to let you die? After all, you are a delicious food that I found with great difficulty. After saying that, he bit her neck with his sharp, bloody teeth. He didn't show any mercy and didn't pity her anymore. He wantonly plundered her life and blood. Wei Wei Bai. Oh my God, it's really a split. And read the full article at https://www.
Sashu.
Read the full article at https://www.
Sashu.
At the bottom to record the reading record. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.